Sometimes the things we think are worthless turn out to be the most precious gifts of all. Eli Mercer never imagined that inheriting a broken-down church would change his life forever. The single father was broke, working small jobs to keep food on the table for his 8-year-old daughter Luna. After a hard divorce left them with almost nothing, this old church seemed like another burden. The building had no heat, no water, and weeds growing through broken windows. People in town laughed at him. They called it a joke from God. But Eli saw something different. He saw a chance to give Luna the home she deserved. What he found underneath changed everything. Hidden beneath the church was a treasure worth $180 million. Art stolen from the Nazis and hidden by a brave priest during World War II. Now Eli had to protect this discovery from greedy people who wanted to take it away. Would this treasure save his family, or would it destroy the small town that had become their home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eli Mercer had always believed that a man's worth wasn't measured by the size of his bank account, but by the strength of his character and the love he showed his family. That belief had been tested more than he cared to admit over the past 2 years. Standing in the parking lot of Cedar Falls Elementary, watching Luna skip toward him with her backpack bouncing against her small frame, he felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of responsibility, mixed with pure, overwhelming love. "Daddy!" Luna called out, her dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight. She clutched a piece of construction paper in her free hand, waving it like a flag of victory. "Look what I made!" Eli knelt down as she reached him, accepting the drawing with the reverence it deserved. Luna's artwork had always been special, but lately her pictures had taken on an almost mystical quality. This one showed a tall building with a cross on top, surrounded by what looked like angels with glowing halos. The detail was remarkable for an 8-year-old, tiny windows, carefully drawn stones, even small flowers growing around the base. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, studying the intricate lines. "What made you think of this?" Luna shrugged in that carefree way children do when something feels natural to them. "I dreamed about it last night. There were people inside, but they were hiding. And there were pretty things buried underneath, like treasure." Eli felt a chill run down his spine, though he couldn't say why. Dreams were just dreams after all. But Luna had always been perceptive in ways that sometimes unnerved him. During the divorce proceedings, she'd drawn pictures of him and her together in a new house, long before he'd even considered the possibility of moving. Her mother, Rebecca, had called it wishful thinking. Eli preferred to think of it as hope. "Well, we should get going," he said, folding the picture carefully and tucking it into his work shirt pocket. "Mrs. Patterson is making meatloaf tonight, and you know how she gets when we're late for dinner." The boarding house where they'd been living for the past 6 months was clean and affordable, but it wasn't home. Mrs. Patterson, their elderly landlady, was kind enough, but Eli could see the way Luna's eyes lingered on other children's houses when they walked through the residential neighborhood houses with yards and swing sets and room for a little girl to run and play. As they drove through the center of Cedar Falls, Eli found himself thinking about the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago. It had been forwarded through 2 previous addresses, worn and yellowed at the edges by the time it reached him. The return address had shown a law firm in Montana, and Eli had assumed it was another bill collector or legal notice from the divorce. Instead, it had contained news that seemed too strange to be real. His great-uncle Matthias, a man Eli barely remembered meeting once at a family reunion when he was Luna's age, had passed away and left him property. Not money, not stocks, not anything that could immediately solve their financial problems, but a church. An actual church building, complete with stained glass windows and a bell tower, located right here in Cedar Falls. The lawyer's letter had been formal but kind, explaining that Uncle Matthias had purchased the abandoned church 15 years ago with the intention of restoring it, but had never gotten around to the project. The building came with 2 acres of land on the outskirt of town, and while it needed significant repair work, it was structurally sound, and could be renovated into a livable space. Eli had driven out to see it the day after receiving the letter, leaving Luna with Mrs. Patterson while he investigated this unexpected inheritance. The sight of St. Mary's of the Prairie had taken his breath away, not because of its beauty, but because of how completely it had been reclaimed by nature. Ivy covered most of the exterior walls, weeds grew through cracks in the front steps, and several of the stained glass windows had been boarded over with plywood. The locals he'd spoken to at the hardware store had been polite but skeptical. "That old place has been empty since before I was born," the clerk had told him. "Good luck getting water and electricity connected out there. The county's been trying to get someone to tear it down for years." But Eli had walked through those empty rooms and felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: possibility. The main sanctuary was enormous, with soaring ceilings and beautiful hardwood floors hidden beneath layers of dust and debris. The altar area could be converted into a living space, and there were several smaller rooms that could serve as bedrooms, a kitchen, and Luna's art studio. The bell tower, if it could be safely restored, would give them a view of the entire valley. More importantly, it would be theirs. No more monthly rent, no more living at the mercy of landlords, no more explaining to Luna why they couldn't paint her bedroom walls or hang pictures wherever she wanted. It would be their sanctuary, their fresh start. Now, 3 weeks later, Eli had made his decision. His savings account held exactly $847, his truck needed new brakes, and Luna's school supplies for the coming year would cost at least $200. By any reasonable measure, taking on a renovation project was financial suicide, but reasonable measures hadn't gotten him very far lately. "Daddy, can we drive by the church again?" Luna asked from her car seat, as if she'd been reading his thoughts. "How did you know I was thinking about that?" Luna grinned, revealing the gap where her front tooth had fallen out the week before. "You get that look on your face, like you're solving a puzzle." Eli had shown her the church the previous weekend, and she'd reacted with the same excitement she usually reserved for Christmas morning. She'd run from room to room, calling out observations and suggestions, her voice echoing in the empty spaces. "This could be my bedroom, and this could be your workshop. And we could put a garden right here where the flowers used to be." The church sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by oak trees that had grown wild and untamed. As they pulled up to the building, Eli felt that same mixture of excitement and terror that had gripped him on his first visit. The structure was massive, easily 4 times the size of any place they'd ever lived. The stone foundation looked solid, and the roof, while missing several shingles, appeared to be keeping most of the weather out. Luna was out of the truck before Eli had even turned off the engine, running toward the front entrance with her arms spread wide. "It's even prettier than I remembered." Eli followed more cautiously, pulling the heavy key from his pocket. Uncle Matthias's lawyer had explained that the building had been properly secured and winterized, but that didn't make it any less daunting. As the front door swung open, the familiar smell of old wood and forgotten time washed over them. The afternoon light filtering through the remaining stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns on the floor, and Luna immediately began chasing the colored shapes, giggling as they moved with the shifting sun. Eli walked slowly through the space, his trained eye cataloging the work that would need to be done. The electrical system would need to be completely rewired. Plumbing would have to be installed. The floors would need refinishing, the walls required fresh plaster, and every single window would need attention. But underneath all the obvious problems, he could see the bones of something beautiful. The craftsmanship in the woodwork was exquisite hand-carved details that modern builders couldn't replicate if they tried. The proportions of the room created natural acoustics that made even whispered conversations carry clearly. This wasn't just a building, it was a work of art. "Look, Daddy," Luna called from the altar area. She was kneeling next to a section of floor where several boards had warped and separated, creating gaps between them. "There's something down there." Eli knelt beside her, peering through the opening. In the dim space beneath the floorboards, he could just make out what looked like carved stone, possibly the foundation of an even older structure that had once occupied this site. Probably just the old basement, he said, though something about the stonework looked deliberately crafted rather than simply functional. We'll explore more when we move in. When are we going to move in? Luna asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. Eli looked around the enormous empty space and felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Moving here would mean leaving their safety net, such as it was. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house might not be ideal, but it was warm and dry and required no additional investment. The church represented a huge gamble with resources he couldn't afford to lose. But as he watched Luna twirl in a shaft of colored sunlight, her laughter echoing off the high ceilings, Eli realized the decision had already been made. She deserved more than a rented room and shared bathrooms. She deserved a place where she could grow and dream and create art without worrying about disturbing the neighbors. 2 weeks, he heard himself saying. We'll move in 2 weeks, right before school starts. Luna threw her arms around his waist, squeezing tight. This is going to be the best home ever. As they locked up the church and drove back toward town, Eli found himself mentally calculating costs and timelines. His construction experience would help with much of the renovation work, and he could probably convince a few of his buddies to help with the major projects in exchange for beer and pizza. The utilities would be expensive to connect, but once they were established, the monthly costs would be far less than rent. The sun was setting behind them as they reached the main part of Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Eli of Luna's latest artwork. Tomorrow, he would call the utility companies and start the process of bringing the church back to life. Tonight, he would tuck his daughter into her temporary bed and dream about the home they were going to build together in that beautiful, broken-down sanctuary at the end of the gravel road. 2 weeks later, Eli stood in the sanctuary of St. Mary's of the Prairie, surrounded by boxes, tools, and the organized chaos of a major life change. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the dust motes that danced in the air. Luna had claimed the small room behind the altar as her bedroom, and her excited chatter echoed through the building as she arranged her stuffed animals and art supplies. Moving day had gone smoother than expected. Their possessions barely filled one corner of the vast space, making Eli realize just how little they actually owned. But what they lacked in furniture, they made up for in determination. He'd already mapped out a renovation plan that would transform the church into a comfortable home over the next 6 months, working room by room as time and money allowed. The first priority was basic functionality, getting the utilities connected and creating a livable kitchen area. Eli had spent the morning installing temporary lighting and setting up a workstation near the altar. The afternoon would be devoted to assessing the plumbing situation and figuring out where to install their first real bathroom. "Daddy, come look at this," Luna's voice carried from the altar area, tinged with the excitement of discovery. Eli wiped his hands on his work jeans and walked over to where Luna was kneeling beside the ornate wooden railing that separated the altar from the main sanctuary. She was running her small fingers along the carved details, tracing the intricate patterns with obvious delight. "These carvings are so pretty," she said. "But look, this part moves." She pressed on a section of the railing, and Eli heard a distinct creaking sound. The wood shifted slightly under her touch, revealing a gap that hadn't been visible before. Eli knelt beside her, examining the area more closely. What he'd assumed was decorative carving was actually a cleverly designed panel that could be moved aside. "That's interesting," he murmured, working his fingers into the gap. "It looks like it was made to be removable." With gentle pressure, the panel slid to one side, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside, wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth, was a bundle of papers and a small tarnished key. Luna's eyes widened. "It's like a real treasure hunt." Eli carefully extracted the bundle, his heart racing with unexpected excitement. The oiled cloth had protected the papers from moisture and decay, though they were obviously very old. As he unwrapped them, several documents became visible, what looked like letters written in a flowing script, a hand-drawn map of some kind. and a single photograph showing a man in clerical robes standing in front of the church. But it was the letter on top that caught his attention. Written in English in the same careful script, it was dated 1943 and began with words that sent a chill down his spine. To whoever finds this record, know that what lies beneath this sacred ground represents both a great treasure and a great responsibility. "What does it say, Daddy?" Luna asked, leaning against his shoulder to peer at the letter. Eli read silently for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The letter was signed by Father Andreas Kozlowski and appeared to be some kind of confession or testimony. It spoke of precious items entrusted to my care, and the tunnels that connect all three hiding places, and artwork that must be preserved for future generations. "It's a letter from the priest who used to work here," Eli said carefully, not wanting to build up Luna's expectations with information he didn't fully understand. "He mentions hiding some things underground." Luna immediately began scanning the floor around the altar. "Maybe that's what I saw through the broken boards that first day." Eli folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, along with the key. The other documents would require more careful examination, but right now he was more interested in the loose floorboard Luna had discovered weeks ago. They moved to the area where several boards had separated, creating gaps wide enough to peer through. In the daylight, Eli could see more clearly what lay beneath definitely worked stone, arranged in what looked like deliberate patterns rather than simple foundation work. "Hand me that flashlight from the toolbox," he said to Luna. The beam of light revealed even more intriguing details. The stonework extended beyond what they could see through the gaps, suggesting a much larger underground structure. And there, just visible at the edge of the light's reach, was what looked like a wooden door set into the stone wall. Eli sat back on his heels, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Whatever Father Kozlowski had hidden down there had been deliberately concealed and carefully protected. The letter suggested it was valuable, possibly even historically significant, but it also represented a complication he hadn't anticipated when he'd decided to renovate the church. "Are we going to open it?" Luna asked, her voice filled with the kind of breathless anticipation usually reserved for Christmas morning. "Not today," Eli said, though every instinct told him to pry up those floorboards immediately. "We need to be careful. If there really is something important down there, we want to handle it properly." But even as he spoke, he was mentally calculating how difficult it would be to remove the damaged boards. They needed to be replaced anyway as part of the renovation, and his curiosity was building to an almost unbearable level. Luna seemed to accept his caution with surprising maturity. "Can I draw the letter while you think about it? Sometimes drawing helps me understand things better." "That's a wonderful idea," Eli said, grateful for her patience. "Why don't you set up at that table over there, and I'll look at these other papers." As Luna arranged her art supplies, Eli spread the remaining documents on a nearby work surface. The map appeared to show the layout of the church and surrounding grounds, but with additional markings that didn't correspond to any structures he could see above ground. There were 3 locations marked with small crosses, connected by what looked like tunnels or pathways. The photograph showed a tall, serious-looking man in his 40s or 50s, wearing the black robes and white collar of a Catholic priest. His face was kind but determined, with the look of someone carrying a heavy responsibility. On the back, someone had written, "Father Andreas Kozlowski, 1943, in the same careful script as the letter. The remaining papers appeared to be in Latin, with occasional words in what might have been Polish or German. Eli's high school Spanish was barely adequate for reading restaurant menus, let alone translating wartime documents in foreign languages. But one thing was becoming clear. Whatever Father Kozlowski had hidden beneath the church was connected to World War II and involved enough risk that he'd felt the need to leave detailed records and hiding places. The letter mentioned artwork and spoke of preserving things for future generations, suggesting cultural rather than personal treasure. Eli looked around the sanctuary, seeing it with new eyes. What had seemed like a simple restoration project now felt like an archaeological expedition. Every board, every stone, every carefully crafted detail might be hiding clues to a mystery that had been waiting 75 years for someone to solve. "Daddy, look!" Luna held up her drawing, and Eli felt his breath catch. She'd somehow captured not just the text of the letter, but the feeling of it, the sense of urgency and secrecy. Her artistic interpretation showed the church with ghostly figures moving beneath it, carrying bundles and boxes through underground passages. "How did you know to draw it like that?" he asked. Luna shrugged, the same casual gesture she always made when her intuitive leaps surprised the adults around her. "It just felt right, like the letter was telling me a story about people who needed help." Eli folded the documents carefully and placed them in his toolbox for safekeeping. Tomorrow, he would need to find someone who could help him translate the foreign language portions and maybe research Father Kozlowski's history. But tonight, he wanted to focus on making their new home comfortable and safe for Luna. As evening approached and they prepared their first meal in the church's makeshift kitchen, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had just taken an unexpected turn. The loose floorboard that had seemed like a simple repair problem had become the entrance to a mystery that might change everything they thought they knew about their new home. And somewhere beneath their feet, Father Kozlowski's secret waited in the darkness, patient as a prayer. 3 days after discovering Father Kozlowski's letter, Eli found himself standing on the front porch of a weathered Victorian house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. The morning air carried the scent of late summer roses from the overgrown garden, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called across the prairie. In his hand, he clutched a manila folder containing photocopies of the documents they'd found the originals safely locked in his toolbox back at the church. The house belonged to Dr. Margaret Whitmore, according to the mailbox leaning at a precarious angle beside the front gate. Eli had learned about her from Betty Crawford at the local library, who'd mentioned that Dr. Whitmore was a retired history professor who'd spent decades researching the local area's role in World War II. "She's a bit of a recluse," Betty had warned with a conspiratorial whisper. "Hasn't been to town in months, and she doesn't much care for visitors. But if anyone can help you with those old documents, it would be Margaret." The front door opened before Eli could knock, revealing a woman in her 70s with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a faded cardigan over a simple dress, and her expression suggested she found unexpected visitors to be an unwelcome interruption. "Dr. Whitmore," Eli began. "My name is Eli Mercer," Betty Crawford at the library suggested. "I know who you are," Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to lecturing rooms full of college students. "You're the man who inherited Matthias Mercer's church. Betty mentioned you might come calling with questions about local history." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside to allow him entry. "I suppose you'd better come in, though I should warn you that I don't suffer fools gladly, and I have little patience for treasure hunters and amateur historians." The interior of Margaret's house was a scholar's paradise. Every available surface was covered with books, papers, and carefully organized research materials. Maps covered the walls, some modern, others clearly historical, marked with pins and colored strings connecting various locations. The smell of old paper and strong coffee filled the air. "Tea or coffee?" Margaret asked, leading him into a study that served as the nerve center of what appeared to be a decades-long research project. "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." As Margaret prepared the coffee, Eli examined the materials covering her desk. He could see newspaper clippings, government documents, and what looked like military records, all organized with the methodical precision of serious academic work. "You've been researching World War II for a long time," he observed. 37 years, Margaret replied, returning with 2 mismatched mugs. "Ever since I retired from the university and decided to focus on local history. There's more to this area's wartime story than most people realize." She settled into a worn leather chair and fixed him with an expectant look. "Betty mentioned you'd found some old documents in the church. I assume that's why you're here." Eli opened his folder and handed her photocopies of Father Kozlowski's letter and the photograph. Margaret's expression changed the moment she saw the priest's name, her professional detachment giving way to genuine excitement. "Good Lord," she breathed, adjusting her glasses to examine the documents more closely. "Where exactly did you find these?" "Hidden in the altar railing," Eli explained, "along with some papers in what I think might be Latin and Polish, and this key." He showed her the tarnished brass key they'd discovered with the documents. Margaret was already reaching for a thick file from her desk. "Father Andreas Kozlowski," she said, opening the file to reveal dozens of documents and photographs. "I've been trying to piece together his story for 20 years. He's mentioned in several wartime reports, but most of the official records were lost or classified." She pulled out a photograph that made Eli's heart skip. It showed the same priest from their discovered photo, but this time he was standing with a group of other men in front of what looked like a train station. The caption, written in Margaret's careful handwriting, read, "Father Kozlowski with members of Underground Railroad, estimated 1,943. "Underground Railroad?" Eli asked. "Not the kind you're thinking of," Margaret explained, her voice taking on the animated tone of someone discussing a favorite subject. "During World War II, there was an extensive network of people helping Jewish refugees and valuable cultural artifacts escape from Nazi-occupied Europe. Father Kozlowski was one of the key figures in this area." She pulled out more documents, shipping manifests, train schedules, and correspondence between various religious organizations. The official story is that he was simply a parish priest who died in 1944. But I've found evidence suggesting he was much more than that. Margaret spread several documents across the coffee table between them. "Look at these shipping records. Between 1942 and 1944, unusual amounts of cargo were routed through the Cedar Falls rail, station cargo that was supposed to continue on to larger cities, but somehow never arrived at its destinations." Eli studied the records, trying to understand their significance. "You think Father Kozlowski was intercepting shipments?" "I think he was part of a network that rescued artwork and cultural treasures from Nazi theft and destruction," Margaret said. "The Germans were systematically looting museums and private collections across occupied Europe. Millions of pieces of artwork, manuscripts, and religious artifacts were stolen or destroyed." She showed him a map of the local area with red pins marking various locations. "I've documented at least 12 instances of cargo going missing between here and the next major rail hub. The pattern suggests someone with inside knowledge was systematically redirecting specific shipments." "And you think those shipments ended up at the church?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes bright with the excitement of a researcher on the verge of a major discovery. "I think Father Kozlowski was running a preservation operation, hiding valuable cultural artifacts until the war ended and they could be returned to their rightful owners or institutions." She gestured to the key Eli had brought. "That looks like it might fit a safety deposit box or secure storage container. And if your letter mentions multiple hiding places connected by tunnels, we might be looking at a much larger operation than I ever imagined." Eli felt a growing sense of both excitement and responsibility. "If you're right, and there really are stolen artworks hidden under the church, what should we do about it?" "First, we need to see what's actually down there," Margaret said practically. "Then we need to document everything carefully and contact the appropriate authorities. If these are stolen cultural artifacts, they need to be properly preserved and, when possible, returned to their countries of origin." She paused, studying his face carefully. "This isn't going to be simple, Mr. Mercer. If I'm right about what Father Kozlowski was doing, you may have stumbled onto one of the most significant art recovery finds in decades. Are you prepared for that kind of attention and responsibility?" Eli thought about Luna, safely at home working on her latest drawing, and about the quiet life he'd hoped to build in their converted church. I'm not sure anyone could be prepared for something like this, but if Father Kozlowski went to all this trouble to preserve these things, then I think we owe it to him and to history to do this right." Margaret smiled, and for the first time since he'd arrived, her expression was genuinely warm. "In that case, Mr. Mercer, I think we should plan a careful exploration of your basement. But first, let me show you what else I've discovered about our mysterious priest." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the church. Eli was working on installing new electrical outlets in what would become their kitchen when he heard a car pulling up the gravel drive. Through the window, he watched a young woman emerge from a compact car, carrying a laptop bag and camera equipment. She had shoulder-length black hair and moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions. Luna looked up from her art table, where she'd been working on a detailed drawing of the church's interior. "Someone's here, Daddy." "I see that, sweetheart." Eli wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the front entrance, curious about who would be visiting their remote location. The woman was examining the church's exterior with obvious professional interest, taking photographs and making notes in a small notebook. When she saw Eli approaching, she offered a confident smile and extended her hand. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Sarah Chen from the Tribune. I cover investigative stories for the regional edition. I understand you've made some interesting discoveries here." Eli felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. "I'm not sure what you mean." Sarah's smile suggested she was accustomed to evasive responses. "Dr. Margaret Whitmore is an old friend of mine from graduate school. She called me yesterday with a rather fascinating story about World War II artifacts and underground tunnels. I specialize in stories involving art theft and cultural heritage recovery." "Dr. Whitmore called you?" Eli tried to keep the irritation out of his voice. He'd specifically asked Margaret to keep their discovery quiet until they knew more about what they were dealing with. "She was trying to be helpful," Sarah said, apparently reading his expression. "Stories like this require expertise in provenance, research, and international law. If you've actually discovered Nazi-looted art, you're going to need professional assistance navigating the legal and political complications." Luna appeared at Eli's elbow, studying their visitor with open curiosity. "Are you here about the treasure?" Sarah knelt down to Luna's eye level, her professional demeanor softening. "I'm here to learn about your discoveries and maybe help your dad figure out the best way to handle whatever you've found. What's your name?" "Luna. I'm the one who found the secret panel." Luna's pride in her discovery was evident, "and I drew pictures of the letters before we even opened it. Want to see?" Before Eli could intervene, Luna was leading Sarah into the church, chattering about hidden doors and underground passages and the priest who used to live there. Sarah followed with obvious interest, asking gentle questions and genuinely listening to Luna's answers. "She's quite perceptive," Sarah said to Eli as they entered the sanctuary. "Children often notice details that adults miss." The church's interior clearly impressed Sarah. She moved through the space with the same careful attention she'd shown outside, taking notes and photographs while respecting the obvious renovation work in progress. "This is remarkable architecture," she said, examining the carved wooden details around the altar. "How much do you know about the building's history?" "More than I did a week ago," Eli admitted. "Dr. Whitmore has been sharing her research about Father Kozlowski and the wartime activities in this area." Sarah nodded. "Margaret's work is meticulous. If she thinks you've found something significant, it's worth taking seriously." She paused beside the area where Luna had discovered the loose floorboards. "Is this where you believe the entrance is located?" "We haven't actually opened it yet," Eli said. "I wanted to understand more about what we might be dealing with before we disturbed anything." "That's very wise." Sarah knelt beside the damaged floorboards, examining them without touching. "If there are cultural artifacts down there, proper documentation from the beginning will be crucial for any future legal proceedings." She looked up at Eli with an expression that was both reassuring and serious. "I want you to know that I'm not here to sensationalize this story or cause problems for your family. But if Margaret is right about what Father Kozlowski was doing, this could be one of the most important art recovery stories of the decade." Eli found himself studying Sarah's face, trying to gauge her motives. What exactly do you think we're dealing with? Sarah stood and brushed dust from her jeans. Based on Margaret's research and what I know about similar cases, Father Kozlowski was likely part of a broader network of people working to save cultural treasures from Nazi destruction. The systematic looting of artwork and cultural artifacts was one of the lesser-known atrocities of the war. She pulled out her phone and showed Eli several photographs of recovered paintings. These pieces were found in a salt mine in Austria in 1945. They'd been hidden by museum curators and private citizens who risked their lives to preserve them. Similar discoveries have been made all over Europe and North America. Luna had wandered over to listen, and she studied the photographs with obvious fascination. Those are really beautiful. Did the bad people try to steal them? They did, Sarah said gently, but good people like Father Kozlowski worked very hard to keep them safe. Like treasure guardians, Luna said with satisfaction. Exactly like treasure guardians, Sarah smiled at Luna, then turned back to Eli. The legal aspects can be complex, but if these are legitimate recovery artifacts, you would likely be entitled to a finder's fee from any insurance settlements or institutional recovery programs. The financial implications hadn't even occurred to Eli, but Sarah's mention of finder's fees sparked a new concern. We're not doing this for money. I understand that, Sarah said quickly, but recovery of stolen cultural property often involves substantial financial settlements, and you deserve to benefit from that if you're the one taking the risks to properly preserve and report these items. She gestured around the church's interior. Besides, renovating a building like this requires significant investment. Any finder's fees could help ensure that both the artifacts and the building are properly preserved for future generations. Eli looked at Luna, who was now sketching Sarah's photograph of recovered artwork with obvious enthusiasm. The practical side of his mind recognized the truth in Sarah's words. Proper restoration of the church would cost far more than he could afford on his handyman's income. What would you need from us? He asked. Access to document the discovery process, Sarah said. Professional photographs, interviews, and the opportunity to research the background story. In return, I can help coordinate with art recovery experts, legal specialists, and museum professionals who can ensure everything is handled properly. She pulled a business card from her wallet. I'm not asking you to decide today. Talk it over with Margaret, do some research on my background, and call me when you're ready. But I would strongly recommend against exploring those tunnels without proper documentation and expert guidance. As Sarah prepared to leave, Luna ran over with her latest drawing, a remarkably detailed sketch showing people carrying artwork through underground passages while a priest watched protectively. This is for you, Luna said, offering the drawing to Sarah, so you can remember about the treasure guardians. Sarah accepted the drawing with obvious emotion. Thank you, Luna. This is beautiful, and it will help me remember why this story is so important. After Sarah's car disappeared down the gravel road, Eli and Luna stood together in the sanctuary, both lost in thought. I like her, Luna said finally. She understands about keeping treasures safe. Eli nodded, though his feelings were more complicated. Sarah seemed genuine and professional, but her involvement would mean their quiet renovation project was about to become something much more public and complex. What do you think, sweetheart? Are we ready to be treasure guardians like Father Kozlowski? Luna grinned and ran toward the loose floorboards. I think we've been ready since the day we moved in. The treasure was just waiting for us to be brave enough to find it. 1 week later, Eli stood in the sanctuary of the church, holding a crowbar, flanked by Margaret Whitmore and Sarah Chen, all three of them staring at the loose floorboards that had started this entire adventure. Luna sat cross-legged nearby, sketching the scene with her usual intense concentration. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed particularly bright, as if the building itself was eager to reveal its secrets. Are you sure about this? Margaret asked for the third time, clutching her research journal against her chest. Once we open this, There's no going back to the simple renovation project you originally planned. Eli tested the weight of the crowbar in his hands. Over the past week, they'd done extensive research and preparation. Sarah had connected them with Dr. James Morrison, a museum specialist who'd advised them on proper documentation procedures. Margaret had translated the Latin portions of Father Kozlowski's letter, revealing references to the sacred trust and 3 sanctuaries connected by ancient paths. Most importantly, they'd contacted the appropriate authorities. The FBI's art crime team had been notified, though Agent Patricia Wells had explained that without concrete evidence of stolen property, they couldn't take official action. The State Historical Society was similarly interested but unable to provide resources for what might turn out to be an empty basement. "We've done everything right," Eli said, more to reassure himself than the others. "We've documented the discovery, contacted the experts, and we have witnesses present. Whatever's down there has been waiting 75 years. I think it's time." Sarah had her camera ready, and Margaret held a professional-grade flashlight borrowed from the university's archaeology department. Luna looked up from her sketching with obvious excitement. "The picture in my head shows a staircase," she said matter-of-factly, "stone steps going down, with wooden boxes stacked along the walls." The adults exchanged glances. Luna's intuitive insights had been unsettlingly accurate throughout this process, from her initial discovery of the loose floorboard to her drawings that seemed to anticipate each new revelation. Eli positioned the crowbar under the first damaged board and applied gentle pressure. The wood came up easily, having been loosened by decades of seasonal expansion and contraction. Underneath, exactly as Luna had predicted, stone steps descended into darkness. "My God," Margaret whispered, her flashlight beam revealing carefully crafted stonework that was clearly much older than the church above. "This isn't just a basement. It's been deliberately excavated and finished." Sarah was already photographing everything, her camera flash illuminating details that the flashlight had missed. The staircase was narrow but well constructed, with hand-carved stone steps worn smooth by use. Along the walls, iron brackets suggested there had once been torches or lanterns to light the way. The stonework is consistent with late 1800s construction, Margaret observed, running her fingers along the wall. But these modifications, the brackets, the smooth finish on the steps, those look more recent. Luna abandoned her sketching and moved to the edge of the opening. "There's something down there. I can feel it waiting for us." Eli went first, testing each step carefully before putting his full weight on it. The air below was cool and dry, suggesting good ventilation despite the enclosed space. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out the outline of a larger chamber at the bottom of the stairs. Margaret followed, her flashlight beam dancing ahead of them. "The construction is remarkable. Someone put considerable effort into making this space both secure and habitable." Sarah came next, continuing to document everything with her camera. When they reached the bottom, all 3 stood in amazed silence. The chamber was larger than the sanctuary above, with arched stone ceilings and carefully mortared walls. But it was the contents that took their breath away. Along both walls, wooden crates of various sizes were stacked 3 high, each one labeled with numbers and letters in Father Kozlowski's careful script. In the center of the room, a simple wooden table held an oil lamp, several books, and what appeared to be a ledger. "This is incredible," Sarah breathed, her camera capturing every detail. "It's like a warehouse designed to preserve precious cargo." Margaret moved toward the table, her historian's instincts immediately drawn to the written records. "Look at this, he documented everything." She opened the ledger carefully, revealing page after page of meticulous entries. Item descriptions, dates received, condition notes, even sketches of some pieces. Eli examined the nearest crate, noting the careful construction and the way it had been sealed to protect its contents from moisture and pests. The label read, "Florence Cathedral Rescued Items March, 1943. His hands shook slightly as he realized the implications. "Should we open one?" he asked. Not yet, Margaret said, still absorbed in the ledger. Let's document everything first, then choose one crate to open as a test case. She looked up from the book, her eyes bright with excitement. According to these records, this chamber contains artifacts from dozens of European museums and private collections. Paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, religious artifacts. It's like an entire museum collection in storage. Sarah had moved to the far end of the chamber, where her flashlight beam had revealed something that made her gasp. There's more back here, another passage. Indeed, at the back of the chamber, a stone archway led to what appeared to be a tunnel stretching into darkness. Father Kozlowski's map had indicated multiple connected spaces, and it seemed his documentation had been accurate. Luna's voice echoed from above. "Are you finding the treasure?" "We're finding something amazing, sweetheart," Eli called back, "just like you predicted." Margaret had continued reading the ledger, and her expression was becoming increasingly serious. "This is more complex than we realized. Father Kozlowski wasn't just hiding these items, she was part of an organized network. Look at these entries. Received from Contact 7 Rome, forwarded via Underground Station 3, awaiting transport to Final Sanctuary. She showed them a page containing what appeared to be coded references and contact information. He was running a sophisticated operation with multiple secure locations and communication channels. This church was apparently one station in a much larger preservation network. Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Which means whatever's in these crates, it was meant to be temporary storage. People were risking their lives to save these things, expecting them to eventually reach safe, permanent homes. And instead, they've been waiting here for 75 years, Sarah added quietly. They spent another hour documenting the chamber, photographing each crate and recording Margaret's translations of the ledger entries. The scope of the collection was staggering artwork from across Europe, representing centuries of cultural heritage that would have been lost forever without Father Kozlowski's intervention. When they finally climbed back up to the sanctuary, all three were overwhelmed by the magnitude of their discovery. Luna looked up from her sketching, which now showed the underground chamber in remarkable detail, despite never having seen it. "Did you find the special box?" she asked. "What special box, honey?" Eli asked, though he was learning to take Luna's insights seriously. Luna pointed to her drawing, which showed a small ornate box sitting apart from the other crates. "The one with the angels carved on it. That's the most important one." Margaret and Sarah exchanged glances. In all their excitement about the larger collection, they hadn't specifically looked for anything matching that description. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "we need to make another trip down there. Your daughter may have noticed something we missed." As evening approached and they prepared to secure the opening for the night, Eli realized that their lives had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just a father and daughter renovating an old church. They had become the guardians of one of the most significant art recovery discoveries in modern history. And somewhere in that chamber below, Father Kozlowski's carefully preserved treasures waited to fulfill their destiny to return beauty and culture to a world that had almost lost them forever. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Eli was preparing coffee in their makeshift kitchen when he heard the sound of multiple vehicles pulling up the gravel drive. Through the window, he watched 3 black SUVs park in front of the church, disgorging a collection of men in expensive suits who moved with the predatory confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Luna, go to your room and stay there until I come get you," Eli said quietly, his protective instincts immediately on high alert. The lead man knocked on the church door with unnecessary force, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the sanctuary like gunshots. When Eli opened the door, he was confronted by a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Eli's truck. "Mr. Mercer," the man said without preamble, "my name is Richard Blackwood. I represent certain interests that have become aware of your recent discoveries." Eli kept his hand on the door, ready to slam it shut if necessary. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." Blackwood's smile was as cold as his eyes. Please don't insult my intelligence. We know about the chamber beneath this building and the items stored there. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for the contents. The contents aren't mine to sell, Eli said firmly. They belong to museums and families who had them stolen during the war. Legally speaking, that's debatable, said a younger man who'd stepped up beside Blackwood. I'm David Sterling, Mr. Blackwood's attorney. Possession laws regarding wartime artifacts are complex, and your position as property owner gives you substantial rights. Blackwood pulled out a leather portfolio and extracted a check, holding it where Eli could see the amount. $5 million, Mr. Mercer. More money than a man like you will see in 3 lifetimes. All you have to do is allow my team to remove the items from your property. No questions asked, no complications with government bureaucrats or international law. Eli stared at the check, his mind reeling. $5 million would solve every financial problem he'd ever had, provide Luna with the best education money could buy, and set them up for life. But something in Blackwood's manner, the casual arrogance, the assumption that everyone had a price, made his skin crawl. How did you even know about this? Eli asked. Sterling answered with obvious satisfaction. Word travels quickly in certain circles when significant art discoveries are made. We have contacts throughout the recovery community. And if I refuse your offer? Blackwood's expression hardened. That would be unfortunate for everyone involved. The county has been trying to condemn this property for years due to safety concerns. A few phone calls to the right officials, citing structural instability or environmental hazards, could make your living situation here quite uncomfortable. The threat was delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who'd used similar tactics many times before. Eli felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. I'll need time to consider your offer, he said. Of course, Blackwood replied, though his tone suggested time was a luxury Eli shouldn't expect to have much of. We'll return tomorrow for your answer. I trust you'll make the right decision for your family's future. After the SUVs disappeared down the gravel road, Eli found Luna sitting on her bed, hugging her favorite stuffed elephant. Her eyes were wide with the kind of fear children get when they sense adult trouble beyond their understanding. Are those bad men going to take our treasure? She asked. Eli sat beside her and pulled her close. I won't let anyone hurt you or take what doesn't belong to them, but we might need some help. His first call was to Margaret Whitmore, who listened to his account of Blackwood's visit with growing alarm. Richard Blackwood, she repeated. I've heard that name before. He's connected to several private collectors who specialize in acquiring artwork of questionable provenance. If he's involved, this has become very dangerous very quickly. What should I do? Contact Sarah Chen immediately, and we need to get federal authorities involved. If Blackwood is willing to offer $5 million sight unseen, the actual value of that collection must be astronomical. His next call was to Sarah, who answered on the first ring despite the early hour. Eli, what's wrong? After he'd explained about Blackwood's visit, Sarah was silent for a long moment. This is exactly what I was worried about. Word has definitely gotten out, and now you're dealing with people who have resources and connections you can't match. What would you advise? First, document everything: the visit, the threats, the check they offered. Second, we need to accelerate our timeline. If we can get federal agents involved and some of the artwork authenticated and publicized, it becomes much harder for people like Blackwood to simply make the problem disappear. That afternoon, Margaret and Sarah arrived together, along with Dr. Morrison from the museum and a new face agent, Patricia Wells from the FBI's art crime team. Agent Wells was a compact woman in her 40s, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with high-stakes investigations. Mr. Mercer, Agent Wells said after introductions, Dr. Morrison has briefed me on your discoveries. Based on his initial assessment and the interest you're receiving from private parties, we believe this could be one of the most significant art recovery cases in recent history. They spent the afternoon in the underground chamber, with Agent Wells photographing everything while Dr. Morrison examined several crates. When they finally selected one to open as a test case, the contents exceeded everyone's expectations. Inside, wrapped in layers of protective cloth, was a painting that made Dr. Morrison gasp audibly. It was a small but exquisite Madonna and Child, bearing the unmistakable style of a Renaissance master. "This is impossible," Dr. Morrison whispered, examining the piece with a magnifying glass. "If this is authentic, and preliminary examination suggests this is Madonna of the Rose Garden by Giovanni Bellini. It was stolen from a private collection in Florence in 1943 and has been missing ever since." Agent Wells was already on her phone, calling in additional resources. "If this is representative of what's down here, we're looking at potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in recovered art." But it was Luna who made the most significant discovery of the day. While the adults were focused on the Bellini, she had wandered to the far corner of the chamber and found exactly what she'd drawn the day before, a small, ornate box, carved with angels, sitting apart from the other crates. "This one's different," she announced, carefully carrying the box to the adults. The box itself was a work of art carved from dark wood, with intricate angel figures covering every surface. Inside, they found Father Kozlowski's personal Bible, along with a leather-bound journal that documented not just his preservation activities, but his broader resistance work during the war. Margaret translated sections aloud, her voice growing more emotional with each entry. "Today helped 3 families reach the Canadian border. The children were so brave, asking only when they would see their parents again. God give me strength to be worthy of their trust." The journal revealed that Father Kozlowski had been part of a vast network that had saved not just artwork, but human lives. The art preservation had been only one aspect of his resistance activities. As evening approached, and they prepared to secure the chamber once again, Agent Wells pulled Eli aside. "Mr. Mercer, I want you to understand the significance of what you've discovered here. This isn't just about valuable artwork, it's about returning stolen cultural heritage to families and institutions who thought it was lost forever. But that also means you and your daughter are now potentially in danger from people who profit from the illegal art trade." She handed him her card. "I'm arranging for federal protection until we can properly secure this site and begin the recovery process. Don't let anyone pressure you into making decisions about these artifacts. What Father Kozlowski preserved here belongs to the world, not to private collectors." That night, as Eli tucked Luna into bed in their temporary bedroom, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "We're really treasure guardians now, aren't we, Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart, just like Father Kozlowski was." "Good," Luna said with satisfaction. "I think he would be proud of us." As Eli turned out the lights, he hoped she was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Father Kozlowski's treasures were safe, and Luna was sleeping peacefully in their sanctuary. The betrayal came from the last person Eli expected. 3 days after Agent Wells had arranged federal protection for the site, Eli was working in the underground chamber with Dr. Morrison, carefully cataloguing artifacts, when his phone rang. It was Betty Crawford from the library, her voice tight with distress. "Eli, you need to know something. Margaret Whitmore collapsed at home this morning. She's in the hospital, and it doesn't look good." Eli's blood ran cold. Margaret had become more than a research partner. He'd become family, the grandmother Luna had never had. "What happened?" "Heart attack, they think. But Eli, that's not the only reason I'm calling. Before the ambulance came, Margaret managed to call me. She was barely coherent, but she kept saying something about Heinrich Weber and documents she'd hidden. She said to tell you that Weber's grandson is in town, and he's not who he claims to be." Heinrich Weber. The name was familiar from the Nazi documentation they'd found with Father Kozlowski's papers. Weber had been an SS officer involved in art-looting operations in occupied territories. Eli hung up and immediately called Sarah Chen, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Next, he tried Agent Wells, who answered on the first ring. "Agent Wells, it's Eli Mercer. We may have a problem." After he'd explained Betty's call, Agent Wells was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Mercer, I need you to listen carefully. Are you alone in the chamber right now?" "Dr. Morrison is here with me." "Good. I want both of you to come up immediately and lock that entrance. Don't touch anything else. Don't document anything else. I'm sending backup to your location right now." "What's going on?" "I'll explain when I get there. Just get out of that chamber and keep your daughter close." As Eli and Dr. Morrison climbed the stone steps back to the sanctuary, Eli's mind was racing. Margaret's cryptic warning about Heinrich Weber's grandson suggested that someone connected to their investigation wasn't who they claimed to be. But who? Luna was at her art table when they emerged from the chamber, working on what had become an increasingly dark series of drawings. This latest sketch showed shadowy figures surrounding the church, with one figure standing inside, among the artifacts. "Luna, what made you draw this?" She looked up with troubled eyes. "Bad dreams. Someone who pretends to be good but really wants to hurt the treasure guardians." Before Eli could ask more questions, they heard vehicles approaching. Through the window, Eli saw Agent Wells arriving with two other federal agents, followed closely by an ambulance that made his heart skip. But the third vehicle was Sarah Chen's car, and the sight of her emerging unharmed brought relief flooding through him. At least one person he'd trusted was exactly who she claimed to be. Agent Wells entered the church with her weapon drawn, her eyes scanning the interior with professional caution. "Where's Dr. Morrison?" "Right here," Dr. Morrison called from the kitchen area, where he'd been washing his hands. "Agent Wells, what's the emergency?" Instead of answering, Agent Wells nodded to one of the other agents, who immediately moved toward Dr. Morrison. "Dr. James Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit art theft and fraud." "What?" Eli stared in shock as the agent began reading Dr. Morrison his rights. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," Agent Wells said grimly. "We've been investigating Dr. Morrison for months in connection with several suspicious art authentication cases. When this discovery was reported, it provided the perfect opportunity to catch him in the act." Dr. Morrison's expression shifted from confusion to something cold and calculating. "You have no proof of anything." "Actually, we do." Sarah Chen stepped forward, and Eli noticed she was carrying recording equipment. "Everything you said down in that chamber has been documented, including your phone call to Richard Blackwood describing which pieces would be easiest to remove and forge authentication for." Eli felt the world tilting around him. "You've been working with Blackwood?" Dr. Morrison laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the sanctuary walls. "Working with him? Richard Blackwood is my client, has been for years. Do you have any idea how much money there is in discovering lost masterpieces, especially ones with convenient gaps in their provenance history? But you seem so concerned about proper documentation, about returning the pieces to their rightful owners." "Documentation is essential when you're planning to sell something, Dr. Dopp," Morrison said with cold amusement. "Buyers want authentication, provenance research, official records. I was simply doing the preliminary work to maximize the collection's value." Agent Wells stepped closer to Dr. Morrison. "What we want to know is how you knew about this discovery so quickly. Our investigation suggests information was leaked before Mr. Mercer even contacted federal authorities." Dr. Morrison's silence was telling, but Sarah provided the answer. "It was Margaret Whitmore," she said quietly. "Not intentionally, she was being used. Dr. Morrison had cultivated a relationship with her over the years, presenting himself as a legitimate researcher interested in her World War II studies. When she called him about Eli's discovery, she thought she was bringing in an expert to help." Eli felt sick. Margaret's collapse wasn't just a heart attack brought on by age, and stress it was the result of learning she'd been manipulated by someone she'd trusted. Agent Wells continued the explanation. Dr. Morrison immediately contacted his network, including Blackwood. The plan was to use Morrison's legitimate credentials to gain access to the collection, then gradually replace authentic pieces with high-quality forgeries while selling the originals through private channels. "And if that hadn't worked?" Eli asked. "Blackwood's visit was Plan B," Agent Wells said. intimidation and legal pressure to force you to sell the entire collection to them outright. As Dr. Morrison was led away, Luna tugged on Eli's shirt. "Daddy, what about the special box, the one with the angels?" In all the chaos, Eli had almost forgotten about Father Kozlowski's personal effects. Agent Wells immediately looked alert. "What special box?" "Luna found something yesterday that we hadn't examined yet," Eli explained. "A carved box with Father Kozlowski's personal Bible and journal." "Show me." Back in the chamber, Luna led them directly to the ornate box she'd discovered. But when Agent Wells opened it, she found more than just religious items. Hidden in a secret compartment in the bottom were additional documents, modern documents. "These are financial records," Agent Wells said, examining the papers with her flashlight. "Bank accounts, safety deposit box numbers, contact information." She looked up with excitement. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just researching Father Kozlowski's operation, she was trying to complete it. Sarah read over Agent Wells' shoulder. "These accounts contain funds specifically designated for returning artifacts to their countries of origin and compensating families who lost property during the war." "Father Kozlowski set up a trust fund?" Eli asked. "Not Father Kozlowski," Agent Wells said. "Margaret Whitmore. She'd been using her research to track down the rightful owners of artifacts, and she'd established a foundation to handle returns and compensation when items were eventually recovered." The revelation cast Margaret's work in an entirely new light. She hadn't just been studying history, she'd been actively working to right historical wrongs. Agent Wells carefully gathered all the documents. "This changes everything about how we handle this recovery. Instead of a typical federal investigation, we're looking at a privately funded repatriation program that's been in development for decades." "What does that mean for us?" Eli asked. "It means that Margaret Whitmore's foundation will handle the legal aspects of returning these artifacts to their proper owners. It also means that her research has already identified most of the legitimate claimants, which will make the process much faster and cleaner than typical art recovery cases." As they secured the chamber for the night, Sarah pulled Eli aside. "There's something else you should know," she said. "I spoke with the hospital about Margaret. She's stable, but she's been asking for you and Luna. She wants to make sure you understand that this foundation, it's something she's been building for you. For us? She never had children of her own, but she told the nurses that she finally found the family she was meant to help. The foundation will provide a substantial income for managing the repatriation process, and there's a provision that makes Luna a beneficiary for her education and future." Eli looked around the sanctuary that had become their home and battlefield. Margaret really thought of everything. "She's been planning this for 30 years, Sarah said. She just needed the right people to help her complete it." That night, as Eli tucked Luna into bed, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Is Dr. Morrison really a bad man?" "He made some very bad choices," Eli said carefully. "But the important thing is that the good people won, and the treasures are safe." Luna nodded with satisfaction. "Father Kozlowski and Margaret are good treasure guardians. They picked us to help because they knew we would keep the treasures safe too." Looking at his daughter's trusting face, Eli realized she was right. They hadn't stumbled into this discovery by accident. They'd been chosen for it, by circumstances and people who'd spent their lives working to preserve what was precious and return what had been stolen. Margaret Whitmore looked smaller in the hospital bed, her usually sharp eyes clouded with medication and exhaustion. But when she saw Eli and Luna enter her room, her face brightened with a smile that reminded them both why they'd grown to love her so deeply. "My dear treasure guardians," she said, her voice weak but warm, "I hear you've had quite an adventure while I've been resting." Luna immediately climbed into the chair beside Margaret's bed, carefully placing her latest drawing on the blanket. It showed Margaret, Eli, and Luna standing together in front of the church, with ghostly figures of Father Kozlowski and other treasure guardians watching approvingly from the background. "The doctors say you're going to be okay," Luna announced with the matter-of-fact confidence of childhood. "And I drew this to help you remember why you need to get better." Margaret studied the drawing with obvious emotion. "It's beautiful, sweetheart, And yes, I'm going to get better because we still have work to do." She turned to Eli, her expression becoming more serious. "Agent Wells briefed me on Dr. Morrison's arrest. I feel responsible for bringing that man into our circle." "You couldn't have known," Eli said gently. "He fooled everyone, including federal investigators." "Perhaps, but it taught me something important about trust and verification." Margaret reached for a folder on her bedside table. "Which is why I asked you both to come here today. There are things you need to know about the Foundation and about what happens next." Over the next hour, Margaret explained the full scope of what she'd been building for 3 decades. The Margaret Whitmore Foundation for Cultural Repatriation wasn't just about returning stolen artwork, it was about healing historical wounds and reconnecting families with their lost heritage. The foundation currently holds accounts worth over $12 million, Margaret explained. "Money I've saved and invested specifically for this purpose. When artifacts are returned to their rightful owners or institutions, the foundation provides funding for proper conservation, display, and educational programs." She showed them a thick folder containing research on specific pieces from Father Kozlowski's collection. "I've already identified the families or institutions that should receive most of these items. Some will go to major museums, others to small community centers, and several pieces will be returned to families who thought their heritage was lost forever." Luna was studying a photograph of a small painting showing a family with children. "Will the children in this picture get to see their family's treasure again?" "Actually," Margaret said with a gentle smile, "the children in that portrait are now grandparents living in New York. And yes, they're going to be very surprised to learn that their great-grandfather's painting survived the war." Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders once again. "What do you need from us?" "I need you to become the operational directors of the foundation," Margaret said. "The foundation will purchase the church property from you at fair market value, then hire you to manage the repatriation process and maintain the site as a cultural center and museum." She pulled out a legal document that had clearly been prepared before her hospitalization. "The salary for managing the foundation is substantial enough to provide Luna with the finest education available and to ensure your family's financial security for generations." "But why us?" Eli asked. "Surely there are people with more experience in museum management or international law." Margaret's eyes grew bright with conviction. "Because experience isn't what this requires. It requires integrity, compassion, and the kind of wisdom that comes from understanding what it means to lose everything and still choose to do what's right." She looked at Luna, who was carefully studying each photograph in the folder. "And because Luna has a gift for seeing the truth in things, she's going to be essential to this work." "What kind of gift?" Luna asked, looking up from the photos. "You see with your heart as well as your eyes," Margaret explained. "That drawing you made of the underground chamber before you'd ever seen it, that wasn't coincidence. Some people are naturally attuned to history and emotion in ways that help them understand what's really important." Over the following week, preparations for the formal recovery process began in earnest. Agent Wells coordinated with international law enforcement agencies, while Sarah worked on documentation that would tell the world about Father Kozlowski's remarkable preservation network. But it was the human stories that made the deepest impact on Eli and Luna. The first family reunion happened on a sunny Thursday morning. Rosa and Mario Benedetti, both in their 70s, traveled from New York to see the return of their great-grandfather's paintings, 3 small landscapes that had hung in their family's Florence apartment before the war. Luna watched from the sanctuary as the elderly couple examined the paintings with tears streaming down their faces. "These were in our great-grandfather's study," Rosa explained to Eli. "When the soldiers came, our great-grandmother grabbed what she could carry and ran with the children. She always said the paintings were lost forever." Mario ran his fingers gently along the frame of one landscape. "She used to tell us stories about each painting, where our great-grandfather bought them, what they meant to the family. We thought those stories would die with us. Now you can tell them to your grandchildren," Luna said solemnly. "Yes," Rosa said, smiling through her tears. "Now we can." Similar scenes played out over the following days, as word spread through networks of families, historians, and museum professionals. Each return brought its own emotional weight, its own story of loss and recovery. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived from the Madrid Museum of Fine Arts to reclaim a collection of Spanish religious artifacts that had been thought destroyed during the Civil War. Professor Johann Müller represented the Berlin Museum of Jewish History in recovering ceremonial items that had been looted from synagogues across Eastern Europe. But it was the arrival of Cardinal Alessandro Torretti from the Vatican that brought the most significant validation of their work. Father Kozlowski was never officially recognized for his wartime activities. The cardinal explained as he examined religious artifacts that had been saved from churches across occupied Europe. The Vatican's wartime records were incomplete, and many of his fellow resistance workers didn't survive the war. He held up a small silver chalice that bore inscriptions in multiple languages. But these artifacts tell the story of a man who risked everything to preserve what was sacred to others. The Church wishes to formally recognize Father Kozlowski as a righteous protector, someone who embodied the highest ideals of human compassion. Luna had been listening to these conversations with growing excitement, and that evening she approached Eli with an idea that was both simple and profound. "Daddy, I think we should have a big ceremony, not just for giving back the treasures, but for celebrating all the treasure guardians, Father Kozlowski, Margaret, even us." "What kind of ceremony?" "Like a party, but more serious, where everyone can see how the treasure guardians kept the beautiful things safe, and how the families get them back, and how it makes everyone happy." Eli discussed Luna's idea with Margaret, who was now well enough to participate in planning from her hospital room. "A repatriation celebration," Margaret mused. "I love it. We could invite all the families, the museum representatives, even some of the local community members who've been wondering what all the excitement is about." Agent Wells supported the idea from a practical standpoint. Public events like this help demonstrate the legal and ethical legitimacy of art recovery work. It also provides closure for families who've been waiting decades for resolution. Sarah was immediately enthusiastic about the media possibilities. This could become a model for how art recovery should be handled, not as government seizures or legal battles, but as celebrations of cultural preservation and family healing. Plans began taking shape for an event that would transform the church into a showcase for Father Kozlowski's remarkable preservation work. The ceremony would include formal presentations to families and institutions, exhibitions of recovered artwork, and educational displays about wartime cultural preservation efforts. But as the date approached, Eli found himself feeling increasingly nervous about the public attention. Their quiet renovation project had become an international story, and dozens of media outlets were requesting interviews and access. "Are we ready for all this?" he asked Margaret during one of their planning sessions. Margaret smiled, with the confidence of someone who'd spent 30 years preparing for exactly this moment. "We're as ready as anyone could be. But more importantly, this is what Father Kozlowski hoped would happen someday, that his work would be revealed and celebrated, and that the beautiful things he protected would find their way home." Luna, who had been quietly sketching during their conversation, looked up with bright eyes. "And after the celebration, we get to keep being treasure guardians for all the new beautiful things that people will bring us to keep safe." Both Margaret and Eli looked at her with surprise. "What new beautiful things?" Eli asked. Luna shrugged with her characteristic wisdom. "Once people know there's a safe place for treasures, they'll bring us more things that need protecting. That's what treasure guardians do. They keep the beautiful things safe until it's time for them to go home." As Eli looked around the sanctuary that had become their home, their mission, and their legacy, he realized Luna was probably right. Father Kozlowski's work hadn't ended with his death, it had simply waited for the right people to continue it. And now, with Margaret's foundation providing the resources and structure, with Luna's intuitive understanding of what needed protecting, and with a community of families and institutions who trusted them to do the right thing, they were ready to become the next generation of treasure guardians. The morning of the repatriation celebration dawned clear and bright, with autumn sunlight streaming through the church's restored stained glass windows. Eli stood in the sanctuary, now transformed into an exhibition space, and marveled at how much their lives had changed in just 2 months. The walls were lined with carefully mounted displays, showing Father Kozlowski's preserved artifacts alongside documentation of their original owners and historical significance. Professional museum lighting illuminated each piece, while plaques in multiple languages told the stories of families, institutions, and communities who had lost these treasures to war and were now welcoming them home. Luna moved through the displays with obvious pride, checking each one with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of getting every detail right. She wore her best dresser, simple blue cotton, that Margaret had insisted on buying for the occasion, and carried a folder containing the speech she'd written about treasure guardians. "Everything looks perfect, sweetheart," Eli said, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. The dark suit was borrowed from Sarah's boyfriend, a newspaper editor who was covering the event, and Eli still wasn't entirely comfortable with the formal attire. "Not perfect yet," Luna said seriously. She walked to the altar area, where the centerpiece of the exhibition waited under a silk covering. "We haven't unveiled the special one." The special one was Caravaggio's The Taking of Christ, the painting that had been worth more than all the other recovered pieces combined. Its authentication had sent shockwaves through the international art world, not just because of its monetary value, but because it completed a collection that had been scattered across multiple continents for 75 years. Margaret arrived in a wheelchair pushed by one of her nurses, looking elegant in a dark green dress that matched her sharp eyes. Her recovery had been remarkable, fueled by determination to see Father Kozlowski's work properly celebrated. "The families are starting to arrive," she announced, her voice carrying the excitement of someone witnessing the culmination of a life's work. Through the windows, Eli could see cars and buses pulling up the gravel drive. The first arrivals were the Benedetti family from New York, followed by Professor Muller from Berlin and Dr. Vasquez from Madrid. But there were others, 2 people, whose stories Eli was only beginning to understand. Sarah Chen emerged from the kitchen area, where she'd been coordinating media coverage, her camera equipment slung over one shoulder. The Vatican delegation just arrived, along with representatives from 6 different countries. This is going to be the most significant art recovery event in modern history. Cardinal Toretti entered the sanctuary with the measured dignity of his office, accompanied by 2 younger priests who moved with obvious reverence for their surroundings. The cardinal's presence lent an air of formal recognition to the proceedings that elevated them beyond simple artifact returns. "Mr. Mercer," the cardinal said, approaching with extended hands, "on behalf of the Church, I want to express our deepest gratitude for your family's stewardship of Father Kozlowski's legacy." Agent Wells appeared at Eli's shoulder, wearing a dark suit that made her look more like a diplomat than a federal law enforcement officer. "We're ready to begin whenever you are." The authentication experts are set up in the side room. The legal representatives have all their documentation ready, and the media pool is positioned where they won't interfere with the family presentations. Eli looked around the sanctuary, now filled with more than 60 people representing multiple countries, languages, and decades of loss and hope. The weight of responsibility felt enormous, but Luna's confident smile reminded him that they were simply completing work that had begun long before they arrived. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eli began, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary's natural acoustics, "welcome to St. Mary's of the Prairie, and welcome to a celebration that has been 75 years in the making." The formal presentations began with the smaller, more personal items, family photographs, jewelry, and documents that had been preserved alongside the major artwork. Each return was accompanied by tears, laughter, and stories that connected the present moment to memories that had been preserved through decades of separation. Rosa Benedetti wept openly as she held her great-grandmother's prayer book, its pages still crisp despite 7 decades of careful storage. She died believing everything was lost. Rosa whispered, if she could see this moment. Professor Mueller's composure cracked when he examined a collection of Hebrew manuscripts that had been saved from a burning synagogue in Prague. These represent not just religious texts, but the intellectual heritage of an entire community that was destroyed. Father Kozlowski didn't just preserve artifact, she preserved memory itself. As the morning progressed and larger pieces were formally transferred to their new custodians, the sanctuary filled with an energy that was both celebratory and deeply moving. Luna moved through the crowd with her notebook, sketching faces and moments that she wanted to remember forever. But it was the arrival of an unexpected visitor that brought the most profound moment of the day. An elderly woman in her 80s, supported by two younger family members, entered the sanctuary and immediately began crying. She spoke rapid Italian to Dr. Vasquez, who translated with obvious emotion. "This is Maria Rossini," Dr. Vasquez announced to the gathered crowd. "She is the daughter of Father Giuseppe Rossini, the priest who worked with Father Kozlowski to coordinate the preservation network. She never knew what happened to her father's work until she saw news reports about today's event." Maria approached the display, showing Father Kozlowski's photograph and personal effects, speaking in Italian through her tears. Dr. Vasquez continued translating. "She says her father spoke often of his American colleague, who was doing God's work in preserving beauty from destruction. She never expected to see proof that their network had succeeded." Maria Rossini's revelation transformed the atmosphere in the sanctuary, from celebration to something approaching reverence. Her presence connected Father Kozlowski's work to a broader network of courage and compassion that had operated across continents during humanity's darkest hours. Through Dr. Vasquez's translation, Maria shared stories her father had told her about the American priest who risked everything to preserve beauty and culture. He said Father Andreas understood that saving art wasn't vanity, it was saving hope itself. When people lose their cultural heritage, they lose part of their souls. Luna approached Maria with one of her drawings, a sketch she'd made, showing two priests standing together in front of a church, surrounded by glowing figures carrying precious objects to safety. Maria studied the drawing with wonder, then spoke rapidly in Italian. She says the drawing shows exactly what her father described. Dr. Vasquez translated. Two priests working together across the ocean, connected by their faith in preserving what was beautiful and sacred. Cardinal Toretti stepped forward, his voice carrying the formal authority of the church. "Today we witness not just the return of stolen property, but the completion of a sacred mission that began in the darkest days of the 20th century. Father Andreas Kozlowski and Father Giuseppe Rossini, along with countless others, chose to risk their lives to preserve the cultural heritage of all humanity." The cardinal moved to the center of the sanctuary, where everyone could see him clearly. The Catholic Church formally recognizes Father Andreas Kozlowski as a righteous protector, and posthumously awards him the Medal of Papal Recognition for his extraordinary service to cultural preservation and human dignity. The formal medal presentation was conducted with appropriate ceremony, with Eli accepting the honor on behalf of Father Kozlowski's memory and Luna standing beside him as the next generation of guardians. But it was the unveiling of the Caravaggio that provided the day's most dramatic moment. Sarah Chen had coordinated with international media to broadcast the unveiling live, understanding that this moment represented something larger than a single painting's recovery. As Eli and Luna together pulled away the silk covering, gasps echoed through the sanctuary. The taking of Christ was even more magnificent than anyone had expected. The painting's rich colors and dramatic lighting seemed to glow in the sanctuary's natural light, and the emotional power of Caravaggio's composition brought several viewers to tears. Dr. Helena Morrison, from the Vatican Museum's relation to the disgraced Dr. Morrison, who had betrayed their trust-provided expert commentary for the media coverage. "This painting has been lost to the world for over 75 years, she explained. Its recovery represents not just the return of a masterpiece, but the restoration of a crucial piece in understanding Caravaggio's complete body of work." But it was Margaret Whitmore who provided the most moving perspective on the painting's significance. Speaking from her wheelchair, her voice strong despite her recent illness, she addressed the assembled crowd with the passion of someone who had devoted her life to this moment. This painting depicts the moment when Christ was betrayed and arrested, a scene of darkness and loss, she said. But its survival, hidden and protected by Father Kozlowski for all these decades, transforms it into something else entirely. It becomes a symbol of hope, preserved through the darkest times, of beauty that cannot be destroyed by hatred or greed. She looked directly at Eli and Luna, and its discovery by this family, a father and daughter who chose courage over comfort, responsibility over easy profit, shows us that Father Kozlowski chose his guardians well. The formal presentations continued throughout the afternoon, with each artifact return accompanied by documentation, photography, and the profound emotions of families reconnecting with their heritage. Professor Mueller received the Hebrew manuscripts with a ceremony that included traditional blessings. Dr. Grieders Vasquez accepted the Spanish religious artifacts on behalf of communities that had thought their cultural heritage was lost forever. As the sun began to set through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the sanctuary walls, Agent Wells made the final official announcement of the day. The FBI's art crime team has determined that all recovered artifacts have been properly authenticated and legally transferred to their rightful owners or designated custodians. The Margaret Whitmore Foundation for Cultural Repatriation will continue to operate from this site, serving as a model for how art recovery should be conducted worldwide. Luna had been quiet during much of the formal proceedings, but as the crowd began to disperse, she asked Margaret a question that surprised everyone. "What happens now? Are we finished being treasure guardians?" Margaret smiled with the wisdom of someone who understood that ending one chapter meant beginning another. "Oh, my dear child, we're just getting started. Word is already spreading about what we've accomplished here. There are families and institutions all over the world who have lost cultural treasures and need guardians to help them find their way home." She gestured around the sanctuary, now empty of artifacts, but filled with the lingering energy of the day's celebrations. This church will become a center for cultural preservation and repatriation. You and your father will help other families recover their heritage, just as we've helped these families today. As the last visitors departed and cleanup began, Eli found himself standing in the same spot where he'd first discovered Father Kozlowski's hidden letter. The sanctuary looked different, now larger somehow, as if the day's events had expanded its capacity for meaning and purpose. Luna appeared at his side, carrying her folder of drawings from the day. "Daddy, I think Father Kozlowski would be happy with what we did." "I think you're right, sweetheart. And I think Margaret is right too. There are going to be more treasures that need guardians." Eli looked down at his daughter's trusting face and realized that she was probably right about that as well. Their lives had been forever changed by the discovery beneath their feet, but more than that, they had been given a purpose that would define their future for years to come. They were no longer just a father and daughter renovating an old church. They were the new generation of treasure guardians, carrying on work that had begun in the darkness of war and would continue in the light of hope and healing. 6 months later, Eli stood in the same spot where he'd first inherited what everyone had called a worthless church, but now the building hummed with purposeful activity. The Margaret Whitmore Foundation for Cultural Repatriation had transformed St. Mary's of the Prairie into an international center for art recovery, and their quiet church had become a beacon of hope for families and institutions seeking their lost cultural heritage. The sanctuary had been beautifully restored, with professional museum lighting illuminating rotating displays of recovered artifacts awaiting return to their owners. The wooden pews had been replaced with comfortable seating areas where visitors could learn about Father Kozlowski's preservation network and the ongoing work of cultural repatriation. Luna's art studio occupied the bell tower, which had been safely restored and now provided her with a panoramic view of the prairie that stretched to the horizon. Her drawings had evolved from simple sketches to sophisticated documentation tools that helped researchers understand the emotional and historical context of recovered items. Museums and universities regularly requested her artistic interpretations of cultural artifacts, recognizing her unique ability to see beyond surface details to deeper meanings. Margaret Whitmore had recovered fully from her heart attack and now lived in a comfortable apartment adjacent to the church, serving as the foundation's director emeritus, while Eli handled daily operations. Her presence provided continuity and wisdom, while her research library had become an essential resource for art recovery specialists worldwide. "Another success story," Margaret announced, entering Eli's office with a letter bearing Italian postmarks. "The Rossini family has confirmed that the 3 paintings we returned last month have been installed in a memorial museum honoring Father Giuseppe's resistance work." Eli looked up from the case files spread across his desk, each one representing a family or institution seeking help in recovering lost cultural property. The foundation now handled dozens of cases simultaneously, working with international law enforcement, museum professionals, and legal experts to reunite artifacts with their rightful owners. "That brings our total to 47 successful returns," Eli said with satisfaction, "and we have 32 active cases in various stages of investigation." The foundation's success had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The United Nations had invited Margaret to serve on a committee developing international protocols for cultural heritage protection. Sarah Chen had won a Pulitzer Prize for her series of articles documenting the Foundation's work, bringing worldwide attention to the ongoing problem of stolen cultural property. But perhaps most importantly, other communities had begun establishing similar preservation centers, using the Cedar Falls model as a template for handling art recovery and cultural repatriation with dignity and respect for all parties involved. "Luna, lunch is ready." Eli called toward the bell tower, where his daughter spent most afternoons working on her latest projector, comprehensive illustrated history of Father Kozlowski's network that would be published by Oxford University Press. Luna appeared at the top of the spiral staircase, her hair longer now, and her face showing the confidence that came from knowing her work mattered to people around the world. At 9 years old, she had become the Foundation's youngest consultant, with an uncanny ability to identify authentic pieces and understand their emotional significance to families. "I finished the drawing of the Warsaw Synagogue treasures," she announced, climbing down the stairs with careful attention to her safety. "And I think I know which family they belong to." She showed Eli a detailed sketch of ceremonial silver items that had been recovered from a bank vault in Switzerland. Alongside her drawing was a letter from elderly Holocaust survivors in New York who had provided descriptions of items lost when their family fled Poland in 1939. "The candlesticks have the same scratches that Mr. Goldman described," Luna explained, pointing to specific details in her drawing. "And see this dent in the wine cup. His grandfather made that when Luna was a little girl, just like he told us." Eli studied his daughter's work with continued amazement at her perceptive abilities. Her drawings consistently revealed details that helped confirm provenance and establish authentic connections between recovered items and their original owners. "We'll contact the Goldman family tomorrow," Eli said. "Another treasure going home." The afternoon brought a familiar ritual, the arrival of visitors seeking the Foundation's help. Today's guests were Dr. Doble, Yuki Tanaka from the Tokyo Museum of Art, and an elderly woman named Catherine Dubois, who had traveled from France with a story about family paintings lost during the German occupation. As Eli listened to Catherine's story told in halting English supplemented by gestures and tears, was reminded once again of why this work mattered so profoundly. Each recovered artifact represented not just monetary value or historical significance, but the restoration of family memory and cultural identity that had been severed by war and violence. "My grandmother hid the paintings in the church basement," Catherine explained. "When she returned after the war, the church was empty. Everyone assumed the paintings were destroyed. Luna had been listening quietly, but now she approached Catherine with one of her notebooks. "Can you draw what you remember about the paintings?" As Catherine sketched her childhood memories of her family's lost artwork, Luna made detailed notes and asked gentle questions that helped clarify important details. This process, combining personal memory with artistic documentation, had become one of the Foundation's most effective investigative tools. That evening, as Eli and Luna prepared dinner in their comfortable kitchen area, now professionally equipped thanks to the Foundation's resources, they reflected on how much their lives had changed since that first day when Luna had discovered the loose floorboard. "Do you ever miss the quiet life we used to have?" Eli asked as they set the table. Luna considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. "Sometimes I miss when it was just us and no one else knew about the treasures. But then I think about all the families who got their beautiful things back, and I remember that quiet isn't always the most important thing." She paused, looking around the sanctuary that had become their home and their mission. "Besides, Father Kozlowski and Margaret didn't choose us to have a quiet life. They chose us to be treasure guardians, and treasure guardians have to be brave enough to let the world know when beautiful things need protecting." As they sat down to eat, surrounded by the restored beauty of their church home and the evidence of meaningful work being done, Eli realized that Luna was absolutely right. They had been chosen for this purpose, not by accident or coincidence, but by the intersection of need and willingness that creates opportunity for extraordinary service. Outside their windows, the prairie stretched toward the horizon under a sunset sky that painted the stained glass windows in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere out there, other families were searching for their lost heritage. Other communities were working to preserve what was precious and sacred. And here, in their converted church at the end of a gravel road, the newest generation of treasure guardians continued the work that Father Andreas Kozlowski had begun in the darkness of war-preserving beauty, restoring hope, and proving that sometimes the most worthless-looking gifts turn out to be the most precious treasures of all. Sometimes life gives you everything you think you want, then takes it all away in a single heartbeat. Tom Callahan learned this the hard way when cancer stole his wife, leaving him alone to raise his 8-year-old daughter on a mechanic's wages. Then his estranged father died, and Tom inherited the old man's ranch in Wyoming. Everyone in town laughed at him. They called the place worthless dirt and said Tom was a fool for leaving his steady job. His little girl Emma needed stability, not some broken-down farm that hadn't made money in decades, but Tom had nowhere else to go. While cleaning out the old barn, his shovel hit something metal buried in the ground. He dug deeper and found a hidden room filled with gold bars worth $50 million. Why had his father kept this secret his whole life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Denver fog clung to Tom Callahan's windshield as he drove through the industrial district toward Murphy's Auto Repair for what would be his final day. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel of his 15-year-old pickup truck, the same hands that had rebuilt countless engines and held his dying wife during her last moments 3 years ago. In the passenger seat, a stack of unopened letters bore his father's careful handwriting correspondence that had arrived monthly for over a decade, each envelope returned to sender unopened. Tom had built a good life in Denver, not glamorous, but steady, honest work that paid the bills and kept food on the table for Emma. He'd started at Murphy's right out of high school, working his way up from oil changes to head mechanic. Old Murphy treated him fair, gave him time off when Sarah got sick, and never once complained when Tom brought Emma to the shop on school holidays. The shop smelled of motor oil and coffee when Tom walked in that February morning. Murphy looked up from the counter, his weathered face creased with concern. "You sure about this, Tommy?" Murphy asked, using the name he'd called him for 20 years. "That ranch ain't worth the dirt it sits on." Your old man, God rest his soul, he wasn't exactly known for his business sense. Tom pulled off his work coveralls for the last time, hanging them on the peg where they'd lived for 2 decades. I don't have much choice, Murphy. The rent's going up again, and Emma needs more than I can give her here. What's she think about all this? Tom's face softened at the mention of his daughter, Emma Rose Callahan, 8 years old with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn streak. She'd taken the news better than he'd expected, probably because she trusted him completely, a trust that terrified him more than any financial uncertainty. She thinks it's an adventure, Tom said. Keeps asking if there'll be horses. Murphy chuckled despite himself. Well, there might be. Probably dead ones, but horses nonetheless. He pulled an envelope from the cash register. Your final check, plus a little extra. You ever change your mind, you got a job waiting here. Tom shook the old man's hand, feeling the weight of leaving behind the only stability he'd known since Sarah died. Outside, Denver hummed with its usual morning energy. People hurried to jobs they'd wake up to tomorrow. Secure in routines, Tom was about to abandon for a gamble on land he'd never seen. The apartment felt hollow as Tom packed their belongings into boxes. Not much to show for 32 years of living clothes, books, Emma's drawings covering every surface of the refrigerator, and Sarah's things he couldn't bring himself to sort through. The wedding photos still lined the mantel, Sarah's smile frozen in happier times when the future seemed certain and cancer was just a word in medical textbooks. Emma sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, carefully placing her stuffed animals into a cardboard box. She'd inherited her mother's organizational skills, making neat piles of books and toys with the seriousness of a much older child. "Dad, tell me about Grandpa again," she said without looking up. Tom leaned against the door frame. He told her what little he knew, that Daniel Callahan owned a ranch in Wyoming, that they'd had some kind of falling out years ago, and that the man had died alone with no one but a lawyer at his funeral. The truth was more complicated. Daniel had left when Tom was 17, choosing a bottle over his family, and Tom had spent 15 years angry about it. "He was your grandmother's husband," Tom said carefully. "He lived on a ranch called Broken Arrow, out in Wyoming where the sky goes on forever." "Was he mean?" The question caught Tom off guard. "I don't know, sweetheart. I thought he was, but maybe I was wrong about a lot of things." Emma looked up with those serious green eyes. "Mama used to say people aren't always what they seem on the outside." Sarah's wisdom, spoken through their daughter's voice. Tom felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Emma said something that reminded him how much Sarah lived on in her. The lawyer's office in downtown Denver felt like foreign territory. Harrison, Associates, specialized in estate planning for people with more money than Tom had ever imagined. The secretary's shoes probably cost more than his truck payment, but Daniel Callahan, drunk or not, had retained the services of James Harrison III to handle his final affairs. Harrison was younger than Tom expected, maybe 40, with the kind of clean-shaven confidence that came from never having to choose between groceries and rent. He spread documents across his mahogany desk with practiced efficiency. "Your father's estate is relatively straightforward, Mr. Callahan," Harrison said. "The ranch consists of approximately 800 acres in Sweetwater County, Wyoming. Mineral rights included. There's an existing mortgage with First National of Rock Springs, currently about 18 months behind." Tom studied the survey maps and property photographs. The house looked like it hadn't seen paint since the Carter administration. Outbuildings leaned at angles that defied physics. Broken fence posts stretched toward mountains that looked impossibly distant. "What's it worth?" Tom asked. Harrison's pause said everything. "The land has potential, good water rights, decent soil for grazing, but it would need considerable investment to become operational." "How considerable?" "More than most people have, Mr. Callahan. I'll be honest, 3 other potential heirs declined the inheritance once they saw the financial obligations." Tom stared at the photographs. This was his inheritance debt and desolation wrapped in legal documents. But it was also 800 acres of possibility, and more importantly, it was somewhere Emma could grow up without him worrying about rent increases and neighborhood safety. "There's one more thing," Harrison said, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Your father left specific instructions that you were to receive this only if you decided to keep the property." Tom recognized the handwriting, the same careful script from all those unopened letters. His name was written across the front in fading ink, and something rattled inside when he picked it up. What if I decide not to keep it? Then it gets returned to me, unopened, and the property goes to auction. Tom slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket without opening it. Some decisions required the right moment, and a lawyer's office didn't feel like the place to read his father's final words. The drive back to the apartment gave him time to think. 800 acres, mineral rights, a mortgage that was underwater but manageable if he could find work. Emma deserved better than a cramped apartment where she had to whisper after 9 o'clock so the neighbors wouldn't complain. That evening, Tom spread the ranch photographs across their small kitchen table while Emma did homework. She studied the pictures with the intense focus she brought to everything, tracing the fence lines with her finger. "It looks lonely," she said finally. "Yeah, it does. But not scary lonely, more like waiting lonely, like it's waiting for us to make it better." Tom looked at his daughter, really looked at her. 8 years old, and she could see hope in a photograph that looked like failure to everyone else. Maybe that was Sarah's gift living on, or maybe Emma just had the kind of optimism that hadn't been beaten down by years of compromising dreams. "What do you think, Em? Should we take a chance on Grandpa's ranch?" Emma picked up the photograph of the house, studying it with serious consideration. "Mama always said home isn't a place, it's the people you love. As long as we're together, we can make anywhere home." Tom felt Sarah's presence in those words, her voice echoing through their daughter's wisdom. Maybe Daniel Callahan had made mistakes, maybe the ranch was a financial disaster, but it was also a chance. A chance to give Emma something more than rented walls and neighbors who complained about children laughing. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom finally opened his father's envelope. Inside was a small brass key and a note written in that familiar, careful script. "Tommy, if you're reading this, you decided to take a chance on the old place. Good. It's got more potential than it looks, and you've got more of me in you than either of us wanted to admit. The key opens the desk in my bedroom. Inside you'll find things that might help you understand why I left and why I stayed away. I wasn't much of a father, but I tried to be a good guardian of something important. Take care of Emma. She deserves the childhood I couldn't give you. Daniel." Tom held the key up to the lamplight, feeling its weight in his palm. His father's final mystery, waiting in a desk 800 miles away. Whatever Daniel Callahan had been protecting all these years, Tom was about to inherit it, along with 800 acres of possibility and debt. 2 weeks later, Tom loaded everything they owned into a rented trailer and pointed his truck toward Wyoming. In the passenger seat, Emma clutched a road atlas, tracking their progress with the excitement of a child who saw adventure where adults saw uncertainty. In his pocket, Daniel's brass key waited alongside the questions Tom had carried for 15 years. The last thing he saw in his rearview mirror was the Denver skyline fading into morning haze. Ahead lay mountains, open sky, and a ranch that might destroy them or save them. Tom couldn't tell which yet, but for the first time since Sarah died, he felt like they were driving towards something instead of just running away. The Wyoming wind hit Tom's face like a slap when he stepped out of the truck at Broken Arrow Ranch. 8 hours of driving through increasingly empty landscape had brought them to this collection of weathered buildings scattered across rolling prairie like dice thrown by a careless hand. The house squatted under the enormous sky, its grey siding bleached by decades of sun and storm. Emma climbed down from the passenger seat, her sneakers crunching on gravel mixed with tumbleweeds. She stood perfectly still for a moment, absorbing the silence that stretched from horizon to horizon, broken only by the whisper of wind through broken fence wire. "It's so quiet," she said, wonder replacing the excitement that had carried her through Colorado. Tom pulled the original deed and survey maps from his jacket, documents the lawyer had insisted he bring. The papers felt substantial in his hands, heavy with legal language that made 800 acres of prairie his responsibility. According to the survey, the property stretched further than the eye could see, encompassing not just the buildings but grazing land that rolled toward distant mountains. "Daddy, look." Emma pointed toward the house where a woman emerged from the front door. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. She approached them with the measured pace of someone comfortable with wide spaces and long silences. "You must be Tom," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Martha Hayes. I run the Historical Society in town, and I knew your father." Tom shook her hand, surprised by her firm grip. "I wasn't expecting anyone. Your father asked me to keep an eye on the place. I've been doing basic maintenance, making sure the pipes didn't freeze." Martha's eyes moved to Emma, who had wandered toward a broken porch swing. "You must be Emma. Your grandfather talked about you." Emma looked up sharply. "He did?" "He had pictures," Martha said gently. "School photos your father sent, though I don't think Tom knew Daniel kept them." Tom felt something shift in his chest. His father had kept Emma's pictures. All those years of silence, and Daniel had been following his granddaughter's life from a distance. "I should warn you," Martha continued, "the town's been talking since word got out about the inheritance. Not all of it friendly." As if summoned by her words, a dust cloud appeared on the dirt road leading to the ranch. A newer pickup truck approached, pulling up beside Tom's vehicle. The man who emerged was maybe 50, wearing pressed jeans and a spotless cowboy hat that had never seen actual ranch work. "You must be Callahan," the man said, not offering his hand. "Jake Morrison. I own the spread next door." He gestured toward a pristine ranch house visible in the distance. "I'll cut right to the chase. I'm prepared to offer you fair market value for this place. Cash deal, quick closing." Tom studied Morrison's face, noting the practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I just got here, and you can see what you're dealing with. This place has been bleeding money for 20 years. Your old man couldn't make it work, and he actually knew something about ranching." Morrison's gaze swept the broken buildings with theatrical dismay. "No offense, but you're a city mechanic with a little girl to support. This land will eat you alive." Emma had drifted closer during the conversation, her small hand finding Tom's. She studied Morrison with the intense focus she brought to homework problems. "What's fair market value?" Tom asked. Morrison's smile widened. 80,000, more than generous, considering the debt and condition. Martha Hayes made a small sound that might have been disapproval. Morrison's eyes flicked toward her with obvious irritation. "That's less than $100 an acre," Martha said quietly. "For land that can't support cattle and buildings that should be condemned," Morrison replied. His tone remained friendly, but something harder emerged underneath. "Look, Callahan, I'm doing you a favor. Take the money and go back to Denver before you lose everything." Tom felt Emma's hand tighten in his. She was watching Morrison with the wariness of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for her own protection. "I appreciate the offer," Tom said, "but I think I'll look around first." Morrison's smile finally faltered. "Your choice, but don't say I didn't warn you." He climbed back into his truck, pausing before he closed the door. "This country doesn't forgive mistakes, Callahan, especially ones made by outsiders." The dust from Morrison's departure settled slowly in the still air. Martha watched the truck disappear with visible relief. "Jake Morrison's been trying to buy this land for years," she said. "Your father refused every offer." "Why?" Martha hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Daniel was complicated. The town remembers him as a drunk who let his ranch fall apart, but there was more to him than that. He had his reasons for staying, even when staying was hard." Tom pulled out the brass key his father had left him. He mentioned a desk in his bedroom. "I'll show you," Martha said. The inside of the house smelled like dust and loneliness. Sheets covered most of the furniture, and family photographs lined the mantelpiece, pictures Tom didn't remember posing for, images of Emma at various ages, even a wedding photo of Tom and Sarah that he didn't know his father possessed. Daniel's bedroom was spartanly furnished. A single bed with military precision corners, a dresser with nothing on top, and an old oak desk positioned near the window. The brass key fit perfectly into the center drawer. Inside, Tom found more photographs, but these were different. Black and white images of Daniel in military uniform, standing beside men in suits near what looked like a government facility. Official documents with letterheads Tom didn't recognize, and beneath it all, a leather journal filled with his father's careful handwriting. Emma climbed onto the bed, studying a photograph of Daniel in uniform. Grandpa was a soldier? Looks like it, Tom said, flipping through the journal. The entries were brief, often cryptic, but they painted a picture of a man involved in something significant during the Cold War years. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. Your father served in the military before you were born. He didn't talk about it much. Tom read a journal entry dated 1963. Package secured as ordered. Morrison Sr. confirmed coordinates. Operation Cornerstone proceeding as scheduled. Martha, Tom said slowly, what do you know about Operation Cornerstone? Her face went pale. Where did you hear that name? It's in my father's journal, along with the name Morrison. Martha sat heavily in the room's single chair. I think we need to have a longer conversation about your father, Tom, but not here and not now. Through the bedroom window, Tom could see Emma exploring the barn, her small figure dwarfed by the massive structure. The building leaned significantly to one side, its red paint long since faded to rust brown. The barn's not safe, Martha said, following his gaze. Daniel always meant to tear it down. But Emma was already inside, her voice echoing in the empty space. Tom hurried outside, Martha following. Emma, come out of there. Dad, look at this. Emma's voice carried excitement instead of fear. Tom found her in the back corner of the barn, kneeling beside what looked like a patch of disturbed earth. The dirt was a different color here, darker and more compact than the surrounding area. Something's buried here, Emma said with 8-year-old certainty. The ground feels different. Tom knelt beside his daughter, pressing his hands against the earth. She was right. The soil had been disturbed, filled in, and settled over time. It formed a rough rectangle about 6 feet by 4 feet. Martha approached cautiously. Daniel spent a lot of time in this barn, especially the last few years. I always assumed he was drinking, but he never let anyone inside. Tom looked at the journal in his hands, then at the disturbed earth beneath the barn. His father's final letter had promised answers, but it seemed Daniel Callahan had left behind more questions than solutions. Emma, Tom said quietly, I think we're going to need a shovel. Tom found a rusty shovel propped against the barn wall, its wooden handle smooth from years of use. As he began to dig where Emma had indicated, the blade struck something solid within inches of the surface. Not wood or stone, something metallic that rang with hollow authority. What is it, Daddy? Emma asked, crouching beside the growing hole. Martha Hayes moved closer, her face tense with curiosity and something that looked like concern. Daniel always said this barn had good bones. I never understood what he meant. Tom cleared more dirt, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a steel hatch. A military compass lay beside it in the earth, its brass surface tarnished, but intact. Engraved around the rim were coordinates that Tom didn't recognize, numbers that seemed to reference a location far from Wyoming. That's his compass, Martha said softly. Daniel carried it everywhere during his last years. I thought it was just sentiment. Tom picked up the compass, feeling its weight in his palm. The needle pointed true north, but the engraved coordinates puzzled him. They didn't match any local landmarks he could think of, and the precision suggested they marked something specific and important. We should probably stop here for today, Martha said, glancing toward the road. People talk in small towns, and Jake Morrison has friends. Tom reluctantly agreed, covering the hatch with an old tarp, and Emma's promise to keep their discovery secret. That evening, he enrolled Emma in Sweetwater Elementary while she explored the ranch house, her child's adaptability already turning the strange into familiar. The school principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, was kind but direct. Emma will do fine academically, she said after reviewing Emma's Denver records, but small towns can be hard on outsiders, especially when there's family history involved. What kind of history? Your father had a reputation, Mr. Callahan. Fair or not, some of that might follow Emma until people get to know her. Tom watched Emma through the office window as she played alone on the playground, her natural friendliness meeting with cautious responses from the other children. It broke his heart to see her experiencing the same rejection he'd felt as a teenager whenever his father's drinking became town gossip. The next morning brought Jake Morrison to their front door again, this time with a man Tom didn't recognize. Expensive suit, city haircut, the kind of smooth confidence that came with serious money. Tom Callahan? I'm Richard Sterling, Morrison Development. I understand Jake made you an offer on this property. Tom stepped onto the porch, leaving Emma inside with her cereal. He did. I'm prepared to double it. 160,000. Cash, quick closing. Sterling's smile was practiced perfection. I represent investors interested in developing this area. Ranch land, recreational opportunities, that sort of thing. The offer was more money than Tom had ever imagined, having enough to set Emma up for college and give them both security. But something in Sterling's eagerness reminded him of Morrison's press-too-hard friendliness. That's generous, Tom said carefully, but I'm not ready to sell. Sterling's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Callahan, I've done my research on this property. The debt load alone makes it a poor investment, and you have a young daughter to consider. Take the money and start fresh somewhere with better opportunities. I appreciate the concern about my daughter, Tom replied, his voice cooling, but we're staying. After they left, Tom found himself studying his father's military compass again. The engraved coordinates nagged at him. Why would Daniel carry coordinates for a place that didn't seem to exist locally? And why had Morrison's father's name appeared in Daniel's Cold War journal? That afternoon, while Emma did homework at the kitchen table, Tom attempted basic repairs on the ranch house. The plumbing worked but groaned with age. The electrical system was a decade past replacement, and every window needed new putty and paint. But the structure was solid good bones, as Martha had said about the barn. Emma looked up from her math problems. Dad, why don't people like us here? The question hit Tom harder than he'd expected. It's not that they don't like us, sweetheart. They just don't know us yet. But they knew Grandpa, and they didn't like him either. Tom sat beside his daughter, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes people make up their minds about someone based on stories they've heard. It takes time to show them who you really are. Was Grandpa really a bad person? Tom looked at the compass sitting on the table, then at the photographs of Daniel in military uniform. I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong about him. Maybe we all were. That evening, Martha Hayes returned with a casserole and information. She'd been researching Daniel's military service, calling in favors with historian friends and government contacts. Your father's records are mostly classified, she said as they sat at the kitchen table. But I found references to Operation Cornerstone. It was a Cold War program, something about securing strategic assets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tom showed her the compass coordinates. Any idea what these reference? Martha studied the numbers, frowning. They're not local, that's certain, but they're too precise to be random. She paused, meeting his eyes. Tom, I think your father was involved in something much bigger than anyone realized, and I think Jake Morrison's family knows what it was. What makes you say that? Because Jake's grandfather, Samuel Morrison, owned the land adjacent to this ranch during the 1960s. According to county records, he sold a significant portion to the government in 1962, then bought it back 2 years later for a fraction of the price. Tom felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together. What kind of government sale? The kind that doesn't show up in normal property records. The kind that gets buried in classified files and forgotten histories. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom sat on the porch steps with his father's compass, watching stars emerge in the Wyoming darkness. The silence was complete except for wind through grass and the distant call of a coyote. In Denver, such quiet would have felt empty, but here it felt full of possibilities and secrets. The compass needle held steady, pointing north toward mountains, invisible in the darkness. But Tom found himself wondering what lay at those engraved coordinates and why his father had carried the location with him until the day he died. Inside the house, Emma slept peacefully in her new bedroom, surrounded by boxes of belongings and dreams of horses. She'd adapted to the ranch with the resilience of childhood, finding magic where adults saw only challenges. Tom made a decision under the star-filled sky. Whatever his father had protected all these years, whatever secret lay buried beneath the barn, he would uncover the truth. Not just for Emma's inheritance, but for Daniel's memory and the questions that had haunted their family for too long. Tomorrow, he would return to the barn and discover what Daniel Callahan had been guarding in his years of apparent defeat. Emma discovered the radio equipment on a rainy Saturday morning while Tom replaced rotted floorboards in the kitchen. Her excited voice echoed from the farmhouse attic, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across wooden planks. "Dad, you need to see this." Tom climbed the narrow stairs to find Emma surrounded by Cold War-era radio equipment, massive vacuum tube receivers, transmitters with military designation numbers, and coils of wire that suggested serious communication capability. Everything was meticulously maintained, protected by canvas covers and positioned as if Daniel had been using it recently. "It still works," Emma said, pointing to green lights glowing on several units. "I think Grandpa was talking to people." Tom examined the equipment with growing amazement. This wasn't surplus store. Junk. These were professional military radios that would have cost more than most people's annual salary. One unit bore a brass plate reading "Property of U.S. Army Signal Corps," while another had been modified with civilian components in ways that suggested serious expertise. "Emma, don't touch anything else," Tom said, but his daughter had already discovered a logbook beside the main receiver. The entries were in Daniel's handwriting, dating back 15 years. Most were brief notations of times and frequencies, but some included cryptic messages. "Package status confirmed. Asset location secure. Waiting for extraction authorization." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the attic's temperature. His father hadn't been the isolated drunk the town remembered. He'd been maintaining contact with someone, reporting on something, for years after whatever operation had originally brought him to Wyoming. A frequency scanner sat beside the main radio, its display cycling through local emergency channels. Tom realized Daniel had been monitoring all official communications in the county police, fire, emergency services. He'd known everything happening in the area, probably including every visitor to the Broken Arrow Ranch. That afternoon, while Emma played in the house, Tom worked alone in the barn, carefully excavating around the steel hatch. The opening was larger than he'd initially thought, and older. Military hardware, this substantial, wasn't buried overnight. This had been a major construction project disguised as ranch work. Martha Hayes arrived as Tom uncovered the full outline of what appeared to be an entrance to an underground facility. Her face went pale when she saw the extent of the excavation. "Tom, this is bigger than we thought," she said. "You need to understand, during the Cold War, the government built secret installations all over the western states. Missile silos, communication bunkers, storage facilities for things they couldn't keep in Washington." "Storage for what?" "Classified materials, documents too sensitive for normal archives. Gold reserves moved out of Fort Knox during the Cuban Missile Crisis." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "Things that needed to disappear if the Soviets ever invaded." Tom studied the hatch mechanism. It was sophisticated beyond anything a rancher would need, with multiple locking systems and what looked like a hermetic seal. This had been built to protect something valuable from both human intrusion and nuclear fallout. Why would they trust my father with something like this? Maybe they didn't have a choice. Maybe Daniel stumbled onto it accidentally, or maybe he was recruited because he already lived here. Martha paused, studying the disturbed earth. Or maybe he volunteered for something that required a man willing to sacrifice his reputation to maintain a cover story. The pieces of Daniel's life began forming a different picture. The drinking that drove away his family might have been performance, a way to ensure no one looked too closely at his activities. The isolation that seemed like failure might have been discipline, the lonely vigil of a man protecting secrets too dangerous to share. That evening, Tom attempted to operate the attic radio equipment, following procedures outlined in Daniel's logbook. Most frequencies produced only static, but on one specific channel, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices discussing the Broken Arrow Ranch by name. "Callahan's been digging around the barn. Morrison says the son doesn't know anything. Can't take chances with this much at stake." Tom killed the radio and sat in the darkness, his heart racing. Someone was watching the ranch, monitoring his activities, discussing him as if he were a problem to be solved. The paranoia Daniel had lived with for decades suddenly seemed completely rational. Downstairs, Emma worked on a school report about Wyoming history, using books Martha had brought from the library. Her teacher, Mrs. Quoten Rodriguez, had been encouraging, but Emma's classmates remained distant. The town's judgment of Daniel Callahan extended to his granddaughter, 8-year-old prejudice learned from adult conversations. "Dad," Emma said when Tom joined her at the kitchen table, "Mrs. Hayes brought me a book about the Cold War. Did you know the government built secret places all over Wyoming?" Tom forced his voice to remain casual. "Is that right? They hid important things in case of nuclear war, money and documents and stuff like that." Emma looked up from her book with serious green eyes. Maybe Grandpa was helping protect something important. Children's intuition often cut through adult complications with startling accuracy. Emma had spent less than a week at the ranch and already understood something the town had missed for decades. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom returned to the barn with a stronger flashlight and proper excavation tools. The hatch wouldn't budge, despite his best efforts. It required either a key he didn't have or knowledge of a combination that had died with Daniel. But around the edges of the steel frame, Tom found evidence that confirmed his growing suspicions. Concrete poured with government precision, drainage systems that suggested professional construction, and ventilation pipes that indicated something substantial lay beneath the ranch. His father hadn't inherited a failing ranch and drunk himself into isolation. Daniel Callahan had been a guardian, standing watch over something valuable enough to justify a lifetime of sacrifice. The town's mockery, his family's abandonment, the slow deterioration of his public reputational, acceptable losses to maintain a cover story that kept secret government assets safe. Tom sat in the darkness of the barn, surrounded by evidence of his father's hidden heroism. Daniel had let his son believe the worst about him, rather than risk exposing the truth. He died alone and scorned, taking his secrets to the grave to protect something larger than his personal happiness. The weight of that sacrifice settled on Tom's shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he was worthy to wear. But Emma deserved to know. Her grandfather had been a man of honor, even if that honor had cost him everything that usually made life worth living. Tomorrow, Tom would find a way to open that hatch and discover what Daniel Callahan had protected with his life's work. Whatever lay beneath the barn was part of Emma's inheritance now, and Tom intended to understand the full scope of what his father had left behind. Tom found Daniel's coded journal while searching through the desk drawers more thoroughly, hidden behind a false back panel that revealed itself only when he pressed against the wood in frustration. The leather-bound book was filled with entries written in a cipher that transformed ordinary letters into meaningless symbols, but the dates told a story of decades-long vigilance. Martha Hayes arrived that Tuesday morning with coffee and the determined expression of someone who'd made a decision overnight. She studied the coded journal with the focused attention of a historian accustomed to puzzles. "This isn't random," she said, tracing the symbols with her finger. "There's a pattern here, a substitution cipher of some kind." During the Cold War, field agents often used book codeciphers based on specific published texts. Tom showed her the radio logs from the attic. He was definitely communicating with someone regularly. "Look at these frequency notations. They're too organized to be random." "Your father was methodical about everything," Martha agreed. "If he created a code, he'd have left himself a way to remember it." They spent the morning examining every book in Daniel's sparse collection, looking for marginalia or markings that might indicate a key text. Emma helped after school, her young eyes catching details the adults missed. "Dad, look at this," Emma said, holding up a worn copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Throughout the book, Daniel had underlined seemingly random letters, but when viewed together, they formed the beginning of a substitution key. Martha's excitement was palpable. He used literature as his cipher base, classic American novels that would be common enough not to draw attention, but specific enough to create a reliable code. Working together, they began decoding the journal entries. The earliest dates back to 1962, describing something called Package Alpha being relocated from primary site to secondary containment. Later entries referenced regular security checks, communication protocols, and increasingly urgent concerns about unauthorized interest from local assets. "Local assets?" Tom asked. Martha's expression darkened. That could mean anyone: townspeople, neighboring ranchers, local officials, people who might have figured out something unusual was happening on your father's property. One decoded entry from 1987 sent chills through the room. Morrison Sr. made direct inquiry about eastern pasture activities. Cover story holding, but situation requires monitoring. Grandchild arrival provides additional security concern. Family presence complicates extraction protocols. Tom realized the entry referred to his own birth. His father had been torn between his duty to whatever he was protecting and his desire to have family nearby. The ultimate decision to drive his family away hadn't been weakness or alcoholism, it had been the sacrifice of a man choosing mission over personal happiness. "There's more," Martha said, pointing to entries from the 1990s. "After you left for Denver, Daniel's communications changed. He wasn't just reporting status anymore, he was requesting permission for emergency protocols." The later entries painted a picture of a man under increasing pressure. References to secondary parties, investigating the ranch, equipment failures that threatened package security, and growing concerns that extraction authorization might never come. That afternoon, while Emma played at a neighbor's house, Tom and Martha attempted to decipher Daniel's final entries. The last coded message was dated just 3 months before his death. "Package integrity confirmed. Security protocols active. Awaiting final instructions. If something happens to Guardian, son has been prepared through inherited materials." "Prepared how?" Tom asked. Martha pulled out the brass compass they'd found by the hatch. "Maybe with this. Those coordinates you couldn't identify, what if they're not for a location, but for something else? A combination maybe, or a reference point for the package location." Tom studied the engraved numbers with new understanding. Instead of latitude and longitude, they might represent layers of security dates, measurements, or coded references that would mean something only to someone who understood the full context. As evening approached, Martha helped Tom explore the radio equipment more thoroughly. Hidden beneath the main console, they discovered additional coded logs and what appeared to be emergency protocols for various scenarios. Daniel had planned for every contingency except the one that actually occurred before he could properly transfer his responsibilities. "Tom," Martha said quietly, "I think your father was waiting for official word that his mission was complete. Permission to reveal the truth, or at least transfer guardianship to proper authorities. When it never came, he had to improvise." The weight of Daniel's situation became clear. A young man recruited for what he'd thought was temporary duty, probably during the Cuban Missile Crisis, who'd found himself the permanent guardian of something too valuable to abandon. Decades had passed, governments had changed, but the secret remained classified, and the guardian remained at his post. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom sat in the kitchen studying everything they'd discovered. The coded journal, the radio logs, the compass coordinates, the evidence of underground constructional pieces of a puzzle his father had carried alone for 40 years. A sound outside made him look up. Headlights moved slowly down the ranch road, pausing near the gate before continuing past. Tom killed the kitchen lights and watched from the window as the vehicle made a second pass, this time stopping for several minutes with its engine running. The paranoia Daniel had lived with was becoming Tom's reality. Someone was watching the ranch, evaluating his progress, deciding whether the secrets buried beneath the broken arrow were still safe. Tom thought about Emma sleeping upstairs, trusting him to keep her safe in this new life they'd built. His daughter deserved better than the fear that had consumed her grandfather, but she also deserved the truth about Daniel's heroism and the inheritance that came with it. Tomorrow, he would take the compass coordinates and decoded journal entries back to the barn. Whatever combination or key those numbers represented, whatever his father had protected beneath the Wyoming prairie, Tom was going to open that hatch and finally understand the full scope of Daniel Callahan's sacrifice. The headlights returned a third time, moving even more slowly. Someone was definitely watching, evaluating, planning. Tom realized he might not have much time before external forces decided the secret was too dangerous to leave in civilian hands. He needed to solve his father's final puzzle before others solved it for him. Martha and Tom made their breakthrough Thursday evening, when Martha brought a magnifying glass to examine the government photographs more closely. Hidden behind Daniel's false wall panel, the black and white images showed her grandfather with men in suits standing before what was unmistakably a younger version of the Broken Arrow Ranch. "Look at this," Martha said, pointing to a figure partially obscured by shadow in one photograph. "That's Samuel Morrison, Jake's grandfather. He's not just visiting, he's giving some kind of presentation." The photographs told a story of official government business conducted in secret. Daniel Callahan, in military uniform, stood at attention beside civilian officials, while surveying equipment and construction materials were visible in the background. This hadn't been a simple land acquisition, it had been a major installation project. "Your father wasn't recruited randomly," Martha realized. "He was already military, probably selected specifically for this assignment. The ranch wasn't his family property, it was his duty station." Tom studied a photograph showing construction equipment near where the barn now stood. The civilian-dressed officials were examining blueprints, while Daniel and another soldier maintained security positions. One man's face was clearly visibly an older Samuel Morrison, directing the operation with obvious authority. "So Jake's grandfather was involved from the beginning," Tom said. "More than involved. He was in charge." Martha pulled out additional photographs that showed Morrison Sr. shaking hands with government officials. "This was his operation, and your father was the security element assigned to protect it." The implications cascaded through Tom's understanding of the town's dynamics. Jake Morrison's hostility wasn't simple land greed, it was generational panic about family secrets being exposed. The Morrison family had been complicit in whatever classified operation had brought Daniel Callahan to Wyoming. That evening, Tom attempted to use the compass coordinates as a combination for the barn hatch's locking mechanism. The numbers engraved on the brass surface 41-7-23-61 could represent dates, measurements, or sequential inputs for a mechanical lock. Working by flashlight, Tom tried various interpretations of the numbers. As longitude and latitude, they pointed to locations in the Atlantic Ocean. As dates, they might reference specific days during the Cold War crisis. But when he tried them as a sequence for the hatch's combination lock, the fourth attempt produced a satisfying click. The steel hatch lifted with surprising ease, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. The engineering was impressive: enforced concrete walls, professional ventilation systems, and electric lighting that activated automatically as Tom descended into what was clearly a government-built fallout shelter. The underground chamber was larger than Tom had imagined. Main room, storage alcoves, communication center, and living quarters that could have sustained several people for months. But it was the contents that took his breath away. Gold bars were stacked along one wall, with military precision, hundreds of them bearing official U.S. Treasury markings. Documents filled filing cabinets with labels like Operation Cornerstone, emergency asset relocation, and post-crisis recovery protocols. Maps showed similar facilities throughout the western states, all connected by communication networks and supply chains. Tom found himself standing in what amounted to a backup vault for critical government assets relocated during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When nuclear war seemed imminent in 1962, valuable materials had been dispersed to secret locations throughout the country. The Broken Arrow Ranch had been one of those locations. But why had the assets never been retrieved? Tom examined the communication logs and found his answer in a file marked Mission Status Update 1963. The operation had been classified beyond normal levels when political priorities shifted after the crisis ended. Personnel involved had been sworn to secrecy indefinitely, with retrieval authorization dependent on conditions that apparently never materialized. Daniel Callahan had volunteered for what he thought was temporary duty and found himself the permanent guardian of assets worth tens of millions of dollars. The gold alone represented a substantial portion of America's strategic reserves during the Cold War's most dangerous period. Among the documents, Tom found his father's real service record. Daniel hadn't been a simple rancher who deteriorated into alcoholisms. He'd been a decorated intelligence officer selected for the most sensitive possible assignment. His apparent failure in civilian life had been an elaborate cover story to explain his isolation and discourage investigation. The personal cost was documented in Daniel's private notes, stored separately from official communications. Letters he'd written but never sent to his son, explaining the impossible choice between family and duty. Photographs of Tom growing up that Daniel had collected through distant observation. Records of financial support secretly provided through intermediaries during Tom's college years. I couldn't tell you the truth because the truth would have made you a target. One unsent letter read, "Better to let you think I was weak than to put you in danger. Better to be hated than to risk the security of something bigger than both of us." Tom sat in the underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of his father's sacrifice and his own misunderstanding. Daniel had let his family believe the worst about him to protect both them and his mission. The loneliness he'd endured, the reputation he'd accepted, the relationships he'd sacrificed, all necessary costs of guarding secrets that could have changed the course of the Cold War if compromised. Above ground, vehicle engines approached the ranch. Tom quickly photographed key documents with his phone before climbing the ladder and securing the hatch. Through the barn's broken siding, he saw multiple vehicles surrounding the farmhouse: Jake Morrison's truck, Richard Sterling's sedan, and two others he didn't recognize. Emma was inside doing homework, unaware of the men gathering in their yard. Tom's heart raced as he realized the surveillance had escalated to direct action. Whatever patience these people had shown was apparently exhausted. He slipped through the barn's rear entrance and circled toward the house, staying low and using outbuildings for cover. The radio equipment in the attic suddenly made perfect sense. Daniel would have monitored exactly this type of situation, preparing for the day when external forces decided the secret was too dangerous to leave unguarded. Through the kitchen window, Tom could see Emma at the table, her schoolbooks spread around her like a fortress of normalcy. She looked up as vehicles' doors slammed outside, her expression shifting from curiosity to the wariness that had become too familiar since their arrival in Wyoming. Tom reached the back door as voices rose from the front yard. Jake Morrison was speaking with authority, directing the other men like someone accustomed to command. The family resemblance to his grandfather's photographs was unmistakable, the same cold confidence, the same assumption that others would follow his lead. "Emma," Tom called softly as he entered through the kitchen, "go upstairs to your room and stay there." His daughter looked at him with serious green eyes that missed nothing. "Are those the bad men from your worried voice?" Tom's heart clenched at her perceptive question. "Just some people who want to talk about grown-up things. I'll handle it." Emma gathered her books with the efficiency of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for survival signals. Before heading upstairs, she paused beside her father. "Dad, Grandpa's compass is still on the kitchen counter. Maybe you should put it somewhere safe." Tom pocketed the brass compass, realizing Emma understood more about their situation than he'd given her credit for. 8 years old, and she was already thinking like someone who needed to protect family secrets. The knock on the front door was firm but polite, to the kind of authoritative courtesy that preceded ultimatums. Tom answered to find Jake Morrison flanked by Richard Sterling and 2 men whose bearing screamed federal authority, despite their civilian clothes. "Tom," Morrison said with false friendliness, "we need to talk. Mind if we come in?" "Actually, I do mind. Emma's doing homework." "This won't take long," Sterling replied, already pushing past Tom into the living room. "We understand you've been doing some exploring around the property. Found anything interesting?" Tom remained by the door, blocking further access to the house. "Just old ranch equipment and my father's personal effects." One of the federal men stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan, I'm Agent Patterson, Department of Homeland Security. We have reason to believe this property contains materials relevant to national security. We'd appreciate your cooperation in resolving this matter quietly." The words carried weight Tom couldn't ignore, but something in Patterson's manner felt wrong. Real federal agents would have arrived with warrants and backup, not skulked around rural properties with local conspirators. "What kind of materials?" Tom asked. Morrison's patience cracked slightly. "The kind that could get people hurt if they're mishandled by civilians who don't understand what they're dealing with." Tom thought about Emma upstairs, about the gold and documents in the underground chamber, about his father's decades of lonely service. Whatever game these men were playing, it wasn't official government business. "I think you should leave," Tom said. Sterling smiled without warmth. "Tom, be reasonable. This property has been nothing but trouble for your family. Take our offer, it's more than generous, and start fresh somewhere else." "With your daughter," Patterson added meaningfully. "Little girls need stability, safe neighborhoods, good schools. Wyoming can be dangerous for people who aren't careful." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Tom felt anger building in his chest, the same protective fury that had driven him through Sarah's illness and Emma's adjustment to life without her mother. "Get off my property," Tom said quietly. Morrison's mask finally slipped entirely. "Your property? Your drunk father couldn't even keep this place together. You think you can do better?" "My father was a better man than any of you understood." "Your father was a security risk who should have been removed years ago," Sterling snapped. "The only reason he wasn't was because certain people believed his cover story was useful." Tom realized they'd revealed more than they intended. These men knew about Daniel's real work, had probably been monitoring the situation for years, waiting for the right moment to claim whatever assets his father had protected. "I'm not selling," Tom said firmly. Patterson reached inside his jacket, but before he could reveal whatever authority he intended to display, Martha Hayes' voice cut through the tension from the driveway. "Gentlemen, I hope you're not harassing my neighbors." Tom had never been happier to see anyone in his life. Martha approached with the confident stride of someone comfortable with confrontation, her historian's mind already cataloguing faces and license plates for future reference. "Mrs. Hayes," Morrison said with obvious displeasure, "this is a private conversation." "On a public road, with raised voices," Martha replied. "I think it's time you all went home." The federal agents, or whoever they actually were, exchanged glances with Morrison. Whatever they'd planned, it hadn't included witnesses, with Martha's credibility in the community. "This isn't over, Callahan," Morrison said as they moved toward their vehicles. "Some decisions can't be put off forever." Tom watched them drive away, his hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, having heard enough to understand their family was in danger. Martha entered the house with the grim expression of someone who'd seen this scenario before. "Tom, I think it's time we talked about getting some help. Real help, from people who can match whatever resources those men represent." Tom pulled the brass compass from his pocket, its familiar weight somehow reassuring. "Martha, what I found today changes everything. My father wasn't just guarding land, he was protecting something worth dying for. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom led Martha to the barn by flashlight. The steel hatch opened smoothly now that he understood the combination, revealing the underground chamber that had been Daniel's greatest secret and heaviest burden. Martha descended the ladder in stunned silence, her historian's mind struggling to process the scope of what Daniel had protected for 4 decades. The gold bars gleaming under electric lights, the filing cabinets full of classified documents, the communication equipment still humming with standby power. It was like stepping into a perfectly preserved piece of Cold War history. "My God," Martha whispered, examining official documents bearing presidential seals. "Tom, this isn't just valuable, it's historically priceless. These are the actual emergency protocols for Operation Cornerstone." Tom showed her the files he'd discovered, including his father's real service record and the unsent letters, explaining his impossible situation. But it was the official operation files that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy they now faced. "Look at this," Martha said, holding up a document marked Personnel Assignment, Operation Cornerstone. Among the names listed were Samuel Morrison as Civilian Coordinator and Daniel Callahan as Security Element Commander. But the most shocking revelation came in a file marked Post-Crisis Asset Management. According to the documents, Operation Cornerstone had officially ended in 1964, with all assets supposedly returned to federal custody. The gold, documents, and equipment in the underground chamber should not have existed. This means the official records were falsified, Martha realized. Someone reported the assets as recovered when they were actually left here under Daniel's protection. Tom found the smoking gun in a file labeled Financial Reconciliation 1964. Samuel Morrison had signed documents certifying the complete removal of all classified materials from the Wyoming location, receiving substantial compensation for his cooperation in the operation's closure. But the assets had never been moved. Morrison's grandfather stole $50 million in government gold and blamed my father for its disappearance. Tom said, the pieces finally clicking together. That's why Daniel could never reveal the truth. He was protecting the government's assets from the man officially responsible for their return. Martha examined additional documents that painted a picture of systematic deception. Samuel Morrison had reported equipment failures and security compromises that never actually occurred, creating justification for emergency asset relocation that had never happened. He'd collected payment for services never rendered, while Daniel maintained actual security for assets officially listed as returned. "Your father wasn't just a guardian," Martha said quietly. "He was the only thing standing between $50 million in government gold and the family that had already stolen it once." The weight of Daniel's sacrifice became clear. He'd accepted a lifetime of isolation and family rejection to prevent the Morrison family from completing their theft. Every year of apparent failure had been another year of successful mission completion, protecting assets that didn't officially exist from people who couldn't officially be stopped. But the documents revealed something even more disturbing. Recent correspondence, dating from just months before Daniel's death, showed that Jake Morrison had been pressuring federal contacts to declare the site officially closed and seal all records. Without Daniel's protection, the Morrison family was positioned to finally claim the assets they'd attempted to steal 40 years earlier. That's why Jake was so eager to buy the ranch, Tom realized. He knew what was buried here, and with my father dead, he thought he could finally complete what his grandfather started. Martha found evidence that Jake Morrison had been working with Richard Sterling's development company to create legitimate-looking land acquisition that would give them access to the underground chamber. The federal agents who'd visited that afternoon were probably private contractors hired to provide official-seeming pressure. "Tom, this goes beyond simple greed," Martha said, examining communication logs. "The Morrison family has been planning this for decades, waiting for Daniel to die so they could claim rightful inheritance to something they never owned. Among Daniel's personal files, Tom found his father's contingency plans. If the official guardianship ever ended, Daniel had prepared detailed evidence packages to be delivered to multiple federal agencies, news organizations, and congressional oversight committees. He'd spent 40 years documenting the Morrison family's crimes while maintaining his cover as a failed rancher. He was building a case, Tom said, reading his father's methodical notes. Every conversation with Jake, every pressure tactic, every attempt to force him off the land, Daniel recorded everything. The final revelation came in Daniel's last will and testament, filed separately from the estate documents Tom had received. In this version, Daniel explicitly transferred not just the ranch property, but all associated federal assets and security responsibilities to his son, along with detailed instructions for contacting legitimate government authorities. Your father made you the legal guardian of classified government property, Martha said. That's why Jake Morrison can't just take the land by force. The federal assets belong to you now, and stealing them would be treason. Tom understood why his father had maintained the charade until his death. As long as Daniel appeared to be a harmless drunk on worthless land, the Morrison family had been content to wait. But Tom's arrival and obvious competence had accelerated their timeline, forcing them to act before he could discover the truth. The radio equipment suddenly crackled to life with an incoming transmission on Daniel's emergency frequency. Tom and Martha froze as a voice emerged from the static knot, the local surveillance they'd been monitoring, but something far more official. Broken Arrow Base, this is Overwatch Command. Respond immediately. We show anomalous activity at your location. Tom stared at the radio, realizing that somewhere in the federal government, Daniel's 40-year mission was still being monitored. The real authorities knew about the underground chamber, the protected assets, and possibly the Morrison family's attempts to claim them. Martha grabbed the microphone with historian's boldness. Overwatch Command, this is Martha Hayes speaking for new Site Commander Tom Callahan. Daniel Callahan died 3 months ago, and his son has inherited guardianship responsibilities. A long pause. Then, confirm your identity, Mrs. Hayes. We show you as Daniel Callahan's designated emergency contact. Confirmed. Tom Callahan is Daniel's son and legal heir. We have evidence of unauthorized attempts to access classified materials by local parties. Understood. Federal assets will be securing your location within the hour. Maintain current position and allow no access to restricted areas. Tom felt something lifting from his shoulders, a burden he'd inherited without understanding, now being transferred to people who could handle it properly. His father's long vigil was finally ending with the arrival of legitimate federal authority. But through the barn's broken siding, Tom could see lights moving across the ranch property. Jake Morrison and his allies weren't waiting for federal intervention. They were making their final attempt to claim the assets before official help could arrive. Martha, Tom said urgently, we need to get back to Emma. They secured the underground chamber and ran toward the farmhouse, where Tom could see shadows moving around the building. Jake Morrison had brought more men this time, and they were no longer bothering with legal pretense. The brass compass in Tom's pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of his father's legacy. Daniel Callahan had spent 40 years protecting government assets from thieves who wore the mask of respectability. Now Tom faced the same choice: protect what his father had died guarding, or let the Morrison family finally complete their decades-old theft. Above them, Emma's bedroom light was still on. His daughter was awake, probably listening to the sounds of men surrounding their home. Tom thought about Daniel's sacrifice, about the price of duty, about the inheritance that came with choosing principle over personal safety. He was no longer just a widowed mechanic trying to build a new life for his daughter. He was the guardian of secrets worth dying for, facing the same impossible choice that had defined his father's life. The difference was that this time, help was coming. Tom and Martha reached the farmhouse to find Jake Morrison's men positioned around the property with military precision. These weren't local ranch hands. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of professionals, using night vision equipment and communication devices that suggested serious financial backing. Emma met them at the back door, her face pale but determined. "Dad, I called Mrs. Rodriguez like you taught me to do if strangers came to the house. She's calling the sheriff." Tom hugged his daughter, amazed by her presence of mind under pressure. Sarah's strength lived on in Emma's courage, the same quiet bravery that had carried his wife through her final battle with cancer. "Good thinking, sweetheart. Now I need you to go to your room and stay away from the windows until this is over." "Are they here for Grandpa's secret?" Tom looked into his daughter's serious green eyes, realizing she'd understood far more than he'd given her credit for. 8 years old, and she'd already figured out that their family was guarding something important. "Yes, Em. They want something that belongs to our family, something Grandpa spent his whole life protecting." Emma nodded with the gravity of someone much older. "Then we can't let them have it." Martha was monitoring the radio equipment Tom had brought up from the underground chamber, coordinating with the federal response team while tracking Jake Morrison's communications. The official help was still 20 minutes away, but Morrison's men were moving into final positions around the house. "Tom, they're not planning to negotiate," Martha said grimly. "I'm hearing orders about securing the package and eliminating complications. They know federal authorities are coming." Through the kitchen window, Tom could see Jake Morrison himself approaching the front door, flanked by Richard Sterling and 2 men whose tactical gear left no doubt about their intentions. This was the Morrison family's final play claim, the assets by force, before legitimate government authority could intervene. Tom made a decision that would have made his father proud. He activated the emergency beacon Daniel had hidden in the radio equipment, broadcasting a distress signal on frequencies monitored by multiple federal agencies. If the Morrison family wanted to steal government gold, they'd have to do it with official witnesses. The knock on the front door was sharp and demanding. Tom answered to find Jake Morrison holding official-looking documents, his usual false friendliness replaced by cold determination. "Tom, these are federal seizure orders for this property. You have 30 minutes to evacuate before we begin asset recovery operations." Tom examined the papers, noting discrepancies that confirmed his suspicions. "These documents are fake, Jake. The letterhead's wrong, the seal's a photocopy, and the signature doesn't match federal format." Morrison's mask finally dropped completely. "It doesn't matter what you think you know, Callahan. By morning, this property will be under federal control and you'll be another sad story about a city boy who couldn't handle ranch life." "Except federal authorities are already en route," Martha said from behind Tom. "Real federal authorities who know the difference between legitimate asset recovery and organized theft." Sterling stepped forward with obvious menace. "Mrs. Hayes, you're interfering with national security operations. That could be considered treason." "What could be considered treason," Martha replied sharply, "is a 40-year conspiracy to steal classified government property while filing false reports with federal agencies." Tom realized they were buying time, keeping the Morrison group talking until help arrived. But Emma was upstairs, and the men surrounding the house weren't going to wait for official intervention. "Jake," Tom said quietly, "your grandfather tried to steal $50 million in government gold and blame my father for its disappearance. Daniel spent 40 years protecting those assets from your family's theft. I have the original Operation Cornerstone files that prove everything." Morrison's face went white, then flushed with anger. "Your father was a drunk who couldn't handle his responsibilities. The assets were officially transferred in 1964 to your grandfather, who reported them as returned to federal custody while actually leaving them buried on this ranch. I have Samuel Morrison's signed receipts for assets he never moved, payment records for services he never provided, and 40 years of Daniel's documentation proving the gold never left Wyoming." The accusation hung in the air between them, decades of family secrets finally exposed. Jake Morrison had grown up knowing his family's wealth was built on theft, waiting for the day he could complete what his grandfather had started. "Even if that were true," Sterling said, "you can't prove anything. The official records support our version of events." "Actually, I can prove everything," Martha interjected, holding up a file folder, "because Daniel Callahan spent 4 decades building a legal case against your family." Every conversation, every pressure tactic, every attempt to force him off this land documented, recorded, and filed with federal oversight agencies. Tom pulled out his father's original service record, the one that showed Daniel as a decorated intelligence officer rather than a failed rancher. My father was a hero who sacrificed his family relationships to protect government assets from thieves. The only reason your family isn't in federal prison is because Daniel chose duty over personal vindication. Morrison's composure cracked completely. He gestured to his men, who began moving closer to the house. None of that matters now. We have the manpower, we have the equipment, and we have a 30-year head start on planning this operation. What you have, said a new voice from the darkness, is about 30 seconds to surrender before federal agents place you under arrest. Tom had never been happier to hear official authority. Floodlights suddenly illuminated the ranch property, revealing FBI tactical teams positioned around Morrison's men. Helicopters circled overhead while armored vehicles blocked all escape routes. Agent Sarah Chen stepped into the light, her badge clearly visible and her authority unquestionable. Jake Morrison, Richard Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft of federal property, filing false documents with government agencies, and attempting to steal classified materials. Morrison made one last desperate attempt. Agent Chen, these people are interfering with legitimate asset recovery operations. We have federal authorization. What you have, Chen replied, are forged documents and a 40-year-old crime that's finally catching up with you. Daniel Callahan was a federal asset guardian, and his son is now the legal custodian of classified materials you've been trying to steal since 1964. Tom watched Jake Morrison's world collapse as federal agents secured the scene. The man who'd grown up believing he was entitled to stolen gold was finally facing the consequences of his family's generational crime. Emma appeared at Tom's side, having watched the entire confrontation from the stairs. She studied Jake Morrison with the same serious attention she brought to difficult homework problems. "Dad," she said quietly, "is Mr. Morrison going to jail?" "I think so, sweetheart. He tried to take something that didn't belong to him." "Good," Emma said with 8-year-old certainty. "Grandpa wouldn't have liked that." Agent Chen approached Tom with the kind of respectful attention given to someone who'd just inherited significant federal responsibilities. "Mr. Callahan, we need to discuss the classified assets your father was protecting. The gold and documents will need to be officially transferred, but given your family's service record, there are options we should explore." Tom looked at his daughter, then at Martha Hayes, who'd become more than a neighbor in their weeks of discovery. He thought about Daniel's sacrifice, about the price of duty, about the legacy his father had left them. "Agent Chen, I'd like to hear those options. But first, I have some questions about my father's real service record and what kind of man he actually was." "He was the kind of man," Chen replied, "who spent 40 years protecting his country's assets while letting his family believe he was a failure. There aren't many people with that level of dedication." As federal agents processed the scene and the Morrison family's conspiracy finally faced justice, Tom realized his inheritance was larger than he'd imagined. Not just 800 acres of Wyoming ranch land, not just $50 million in government gold, but the knowledge that Daniel Callahan had been a hero worth emulating. Emma slipped her small hand into his as they watched Jake Morrison being led away in handcuffs. The girl who'd grown up thinking her grandfather was a shameful family secret now knew he'd been a guardian of something precious. The crisis was ending, but Tom's real responsibilities were just beginning. The town meeting Tom called for the following Saturday filled Sweetwater's community center beyond capacity. Word had spread quickly about the federal operation at the Broken Arrow Ranch, and everyone wanted to understand what had really happened to Daniel Callahan and why the Morrison family had been arrested. Tom stood at the front of the room, holding his father's final letter, the one document he'd saved for this moment. Emma sat in the front row beside Martha Hayes, her small face serious with the weight of family truth finally being told. "Most of you knew my father as a drunk who let his ranch fall apart." Tom began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "I believed that story too for most of my life. I was wrong, and so were all of you." He opened the sealed envelope Daniel had left specifically for this purpose, reading his father's words to the community that had scorned him. "If Tom is reading this to the people of Sweetwater, it means the truth can finally be told. I came to Wyoming in 1962 as a military intelligence officer assigned to protect classified government assets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the immediate danger passed, I volunteered to remain as guardian of materials too sensitive to move. I let you believe I was weak because weakness was my disguise. I let you believe I was a failure because failure was my protection. I let my family believe I was worthless because their disappointment kept them safe from the truth. For 40 years, I protected $50 million in federal gold and classified documents from people who would have used them to harm our country. I accepted your scorn, your mockery, and your pity because they were the price of keeping America's secrets safe. I was never the man you thought I was. I was the man my country needed me to be." The room fell silent as Tom's voice carried his father's final words. In the back, he could see townspeople who'd whispered cruel jokes about Daniel Callahan, struggling to reconcile their assumptions with this new reality. Jake Morrison's elderly supporters looked uncomfortable, realizing they'd spent decades scorning a war hero while supporting a family of thieves. The revelation that Samuel Morrison had attempted to steal government gold while Daniel protected it reframed 40 years of local history. "My father died alone and scorned," Tom continued, "protecting assets that belonged to all of us. While Jake Morrison's family built their wealth on attempted theft of federal property, Daniel Callahan stood guard over America's emergency reserves." Emma stood up with the courage her mother had possessed, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the room, "My grandpa was a hero. He protected important things even when it made people think bad things about him. That's what heroes do. They do what's right even when it's hard." The 8-year-old simple truth cut through decades of adult assumptions and prejudice. Tom watched faces change throughout the room as people processed the scope of their misjudgment. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, was the first to stand. "Daniel Callahan deserves our apology and our gratitude. Emma, your grandfather was a better man than any of us realized." Others followed the librarian who'd known Daniel as a young soldier, the mechanic who'd occasionally worked on his truck, neighbors who'd seen him as a failure rather than recognizing his sacrifice. One by one, the community began acknowledging the debt they owed to a man they'd never understood. But not everyone accepted the truth gracefully. Morrison's remaining allies attempted to defend their position, claiming Daniel's story was fabricated to justify Tom's inheritance. "This is all very convenient," said Robert Hayes, Jake's longtime supporter. "A mysterious federal operation that nobody can verify, classified documents that nobody can examine, and a fortune in gold that conveniently makes the Callahan family rich." Tom had prepared for this challenge. He nodded to Agent Chen, who'd agreed to attend the meeting in an official capacity. "Mr. Hayes," Chen said, standing and displaying her federal credentials, "I can verify that Daniel Callahan served with distinction as a guardian of classified federal assets for 4 decades. The operation was real, the gold was real, and the Morrison family's attempt to steal it was real." She continued with the authority that only legitimate federal agents possessed. "The documents and assets Tom Callahan inherited are currently under federal protection, and their existence has been verified by multiple agencies. Daniel Callahan's service record has been declassified specifically to allow this community to understand the truth about his sacrifice." The room stirred as people realized they were hearing official confirmation from federal authority. The wild story of buried gold and secret operations wasn't local legend, it was documented history. Tom felt the mood in the room shifting as his father's reputation transformed from shame to honor. Emma beamed with pride, finally able to hold her head high about her grandfather's legacy. "There's something else," Tom said, ready to make the announcement that would cement Daniel's place in local history. The federal government has agreed to let me establish a memorial foundation using a portion of the recovered assets. The Daniel Callahan Memorial Fund will provide college scholarships for Wyoming students who demonstrate the same quiet courage my father showed for 40 years. The applause that followed Tom's announcement was spontaneous and sustained. People who had mocked Daniel Callahan for decades were rising to their feet, honoring the memory of a man whose sacrifice they'd never understood. But the moment was interrupted by a commotion near the back of the room. Richard Sterling pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger and desperation. Federal charges had been filed, but he was still free on bond and apparently unwilling to accept defeat. "This is all lies," Sterling shouted. "You people are being manipulated by a clever conman who's stolen federal property and invented a story to justify it." Agent Chen moved to intercede, but Tom held up his hand. Some confrontations needed to happen in public, with witnesses, so the truth could be established beyond doubt. "Mr. Sterling," Tom said calmly, "would you like to see the original government contract that proves my father's assignment?" From his jacket, Tom produced the document he'd brought specifically for this moment, the official Operation Cornerstone assignment orders, bearing Daniel Callahan's name, federal seals, and authentication stamps that couldn't be forged. Sterling examined the papers with growing desperation, realizing they were genuine federal documents that destroyed his family's version of events. The Morrison-Sterling partnership had been built on lies that were now exposed in front of the entire community. "Even if this is real," Sterling said, his voice cracking, "it doesn't change anything. The assets were officially transferred in 1964. We have the paperwork." Martha Hayes stood with the confidence of a historian who'd spent weeks researching the truth. "What you have, Mr. Sterling, are forged documents created by Samuel Morrison to cover up his attempted theft. The real transfer orders were never signed because the assets were never moved." She produced copies of the authentic federal records, showing the discrepancies between Morrison's fraudulent reports and the actual government files. The evidence was overwhelming: 40 years of systematic deception, exposed by careful historical research. Emma rose again, her young voice cutting through the adult complications with startling clarity. "Mr. Sterling, why are you so angry about my grandpa being a hero? Shouldn't you be happy that someone protected important things for our country?" The question, asked with 8-year-old innocence, revealed the moral bankruptcy at the heart of Sterling's position. He was angry not because Daniel's story was false, but because its truth exposed his own family's criminality. "Little girl," Sterling said with barely controlled rage, "you don't understand the complexities of adult business." "I understand right and wrong," Emma replied with her mother's quiet strength. "Grandpa did what was right, even when it was hard. You're trying to take things that don't belong to you. That's wrong." The community watched this exchange, with growing clarity about who deserved their support. A decorated war hero who'd sacrificed everything for duty, or the families who'd built their wealth on attempted theft of federal assets. Agent Chen finally intervened with federal authority. "Mr. Sterling, you're under federal indictment and approaching a minor in a threatening manner. I strongly suggest you leave immediately." But Sterling's composure had completely cracked. Years of planning, decades of assumed entitlement, and generational wealth built on criminal conspiracy were collapsing around him. "You people don't understand what you're destroying," he screamed. "The Morrison family built this town. We provided jobs, investment, community leadership for 3 generations. Built on stolen federal gold," Martha said quietly. "Leadership based on criminal conspiracy. Investment using money that belonged to the American people." Tom stepped forward with the calm authority he'd inherited from his father. "Mr. Sterling, your partnership with Jake Morrison is over. The assets you tried to steal are being returned to federal custody, and the community you tried to manipulate now knows the truth." "This isn't finished," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You think you've won, but there are consequences to destroying established families. Accidents happen to people who interfere with serious business." The threat was clear and witnessed by the entire room. Agent Chen immediately moved to arrest Sterling for threatening a federal witness, but Tom held up his hand again. "Mr. Sterling," Tom said with Daniel's quiet courage, "my father faced much more dangerous people than you for 40 years and never backed down. I inherited his responsibilities and his resolve. Threatening my family was a mistake." Emma moved to stand beside her father, her small hand finding his with the same trust she'd always shown. Martha Hayes joined them, creating a visual representation of the alliance that had uncovered the truth. The community saw three popular working father, his brave daughter, and a dedicated historian standing against wealth and corruption with nothing but truth and courage. The moral choice was clear. Sheriff Williams, who'd been listening from the doorway, finally acted with the authority Sterling's federal charges demanded. "Richard Sterling, you're under arrest for threatening federal witnesses and interfering with a federal investigation." As Sterling was led away in handcuffs, joining Jake Morrison in federal custody, the room erupted in genuine applause. Not polite community theater, but real appreciation for justice finally being served. Tom looked out at faces that had changed from suspicion to respect, from skepticism to support. Daniel Callahan's reputation was finally restored, and Emma could grow up proud of her grandfather's heroism. The climax was over, but the healing was just beginning. 6 months later, Tom stood in the same barn where Emma had first noticed the disturbed earth that changed their lives forever. But everything was different now. Fresh paint covered weathered siding, new equipment filled the workspace, and through the open doors, he could see Emma playing with friends from schoolchildren who now competed for invitations to visit the famous Broken Arrow Ranch. The underground chamber had been officially sealed after federal agents completed their asset recovery, but not before Tom had photographed everything for the historical record. The Daniel Callahan Memorial Museum, housed in the renovated farmhouse, now displayed selected documents and artifacts that told the story of one man's 40-year vigil protecting America's secrets. Martha Hayes approached from the house, carrying a framed photograph that would complete the museum's main exhibit. It showed Tom, Emma, and Martha at the ranch's dedication ceremony, flanked by federal officials who'd finally acknowledged Daniel's service. But more importantly, it captured three people who'd become a family through shared discovery and mutual respect. "The new display looks perfect," Martha said, admiring the museum setup. "Emma did a wonderful job writing the description of her grandfather's compass." Tom smiled, thinking about his daughter's simple but powerful words. "This compass helped my grandpa find his way through hard times. It helped him remember that some directions are worth following, even when they're difficult." The brass compass now rested in a place of honor, its engraved coordinates finally understood as the combination that had protected $50 million in government assets. But for Emma, it had become something more a symbol of the courage required to do what's right, regardless of personal cost. "Any regrets about not keeping more of the gold?" Martha asked with gentle teasing. Tom looked out at the thriving ranch, the happy children, the community that had embraced them after learning the truth. The federal government had been generous in their settlement, providing enough compensation to secure Emma's future while ensuring the ranch could operate as both a working farm and historical site. "Not for a minute," Tom said honestly. "Dad protected that gold because it belonged to the American people. Keeping it would have made us rich, but returning it made us part of something bigger." The Daniel Callahan Memorial Scholarship Fund had already awarded its first grants to Wyoming students, demonstrating academic excellence and moral courage. Emma took special pride in reading the applications, looking for young people who reminded her of her grandfather's quiet heroism. Jake Morrison and Richard Sterling had been sentenced to federal prison for their decades-long conspiracy to steal government assets. Their family's wealth, built on attempted theft, was being systematically returned to federal custody. The Morrison Ranch would be sold at auction, its proceeds used to compensate taxpayers for 40 years of criminal conspiracy. Speaking of the Memorial Fund, Martha said, "We received another application that I think Emma will love. a young man from Cheyenne who wants to study military history and preserve stories like your father's. Tom felt the satisfaction that came from seeing Daniel's sacrifice inspire the next generation. His father's reputation had been completely restored, but more importantly, his example was motivating young people to choose service over self-interest. Emma ran toward them with the boundless energy of a child who'd found her place in the world. At 9 years old, she moved through Sweetwater with the confidence of someone who belonged, whose family history was a source of pride rather than shame. "Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if we can bring Grandpa's radio equipment to school for the Cold War presentation." Tom laughed at his daughter's enthusiasm. The same equipment Daniel had used to maintain contact with federal authorities was now helping teach local children about American history during its most dangerous period. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Em. Your grandfather would have loved knowing his work was helping educate young people." Martha watched this exchange with the warmth of someone who'd gained more than she'd expected when she'd first approached two strangers in a ranch driveway. She'd come to help preserve local history but had found a family worth joining. That evening, the three of them sat on the restored porch swing, watching Wyoming's endless sky fade from blue to gold to deep purple. Emma was reading a letter from Agent Chen, who'd become something of a pen pal since the federal operation concluded. "Agent Chen says they found 3 more sites like Grandpa's," Emma reported. "Other people who protected government secrets for a really long time without getting credit." Tom felt connected to those unknown guardians, ordinary people who'd accepted extraordinary responsibilities because their country needed them. Daniel hadn't been unique in his sacrifice, just uniquely isolated in carrying it alone. "Maybe someday we can help tell their stories too," Tom suggested. Emma's face lit up with the possibility. "We could expand the museum, show how lots of people were heroes even when nobody knew it." Martha squeezed Tom's hand with affection that had grown from partnership into something deeper over their months of shared discovery. They'd built a relationship on mutual respect and common purpose, the kind of mature love that grew from understanding rather than passion alone. "Your father would be proud," Martha said quietly, "not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you've become." Tom looked at Emma, curled against his side, at Martha, whose wisdom had guided them through their darkest moments, at the ranch that had transformed from symbol of failure into beacon of hope. Daniel's sacrifice had cost him his family relationships, but it had ultimately restored them across generations. The brass compass sat on the porch table beside them, its needle pointing steadily north toward mountains that no longer seemed impossibly distant. Tom understood now that some paths were worth taking not because they were easy, but because they led toward truth, honor, and the kind of legacy that made sacrifice meaningful. Emma fell asleep against his shoulder as Wyoming's stars emerged in their full glory, the same stars Daniel had watched during 40 years of lonely vigil, waiting for the day when truth could finally be told. Tom carried his daughter inside to her bedroom, tucking her in beneath quilts Martha had made, and books about heroes, both famous and forgotten. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight their family was complete and their history was clear. Daniel Callahan had been a man worth emulating, and his legacy would live on through the granddaughter who bore his courage and the son who'd finally understood the true meaning of inheritance.